All right, welcome everybody. For those that are still outside and on their way in, I'll tell you all, the most important thing you need to know all day is, see, that gets everybody inside. So welcome to our conference this morning. Excited to dive in and be with you all to get into this, to give you a little bit of I'm going to start by giving you a little bit of an outline. I'll introduce things, and then I think everybody here I know, but if you're watching a recording or listening to a recording and we don't know you, my name's Scott, one of the pastors here at Cornerstone, and excited to walk into this today. Actually, let me start us off with prayer, and then we will talk about the outline of our morning, and we'll dive in. So let me pray. Heavenly Father, thank you, God, for your goodness and kindness to us. We thank you, God, for the gift of your word, for the gift of your truth, and for who you are as you continue to teach us and grow us. Pray that you would use this time, Lord, both to edify our hearts, but more than anything, God, to glorify yourself, that you might be worshiped more in our hearts, that whatever questions or even anxieties, Father, that raise up in us, God, that they would be opportunities for you to be made strong in our weakness. And so, God, we pray that you would do that to your glory as we go, and we ask all these things in Christ's name. Amen. All right, we should have gotten some notes on the way in. If you didn't, we've got a few extra copies of those. Anybody still need notes? Olivia? On the front is a rough schedule of how things are going to go. We're going to essentially break this morning up into 3 sessions. The first session, we're going to talk about how we talk to our kids about sex and gender. In the second session, we're going to talk about kind of first steps and resources. And then in the third session, we're going to talk about a panel and use some different stories. So in this first session, we're going to take a look at some of the principles that should shape our conversations with our kids, what that looks like, why having these conversations is necessary, and we're going to talk practically about how we talk with our kids about sex and gender and sexuality and identity in the midst of the world we're in right now. And so this first session is going to focus on theology and principles, kind of principles generally. And so I'm going to, Lord willing, refrain from telling too many stories. We're going to save the stories for the panel. We're going to save the stories for later, but just kind of look at some principles and give you some truth in that sense. In the second session, we're going to give you some resources, some tools to help. But the resources without the principles, honestly, there's probably a part of you that you're like, I showed up for the resources. I don't care about the principles. Just tell me what the resources are. The resources, I think, without the principles, actually, we end up oftentimes askew. We need to start with a bigger picture of what we're talking about and how we're talking about it. And then we'll look at some resources, and then we'll talk practically about how that plays out in our lives. So first of all, actually, I was just curious to get a sense for how many of you do not have kids? You don't have kids yet. So a few of you, awesome. Thanks for being here. How many of you have kids that are like preschool, so 0 to like 4 or 5? Okay. What about elementary schoolers? And you can raise your hand multiple times. What about middle schoolers and high schoolers? Few. And what about beyond high school? All right. So actually, we're pretty, in a number of ways, actually, kind of evenly distributed across this, and we're going to talk, and this is why we want to start with some principles, so we can talk about principles that hit us across the spectrum. Jason, you got to be like the newest dad here, right? He's like, you got a weeks-old kid. He's like, yeah, how do I talk to them about this, right? We're going to make this happen. But so first of all, just real briefly, I want to talk about why it's necessary to have this conversation. Now, you're showing up today, I'm assuming you're like, okay, I know why this is necessary, but the reality is we need to talk to our kids about sex and sexuality and gender because they need us to provide them information and clarity in the midst of a world, in the midst of a culture that is in many ways upside down. But this responsibility also isn't new. It's primarily been a parent's responsibility to teach their kids about life, about God, about who they are, about how they were created, about including their sex, their gender, their sexuality forever. Right? This is how God created the world and gave us this responsibility as parents, to teach kids the difference between men and women, to teach kids where babies come from. But admittedly, these conversations have become increasingly difficult in our kind of complicated, really in our cultural insanity. And parents and even the church, I think, haven't always responded to that craziness with clarity and wisdom and winsomeness. And so that's what we're after today. And that's why we're going to spend our time not like talking about all the different things that are out there, but talking about a positive vision for how we can engage with our kids well in this. We also need to talk about this because our kids it's being talked about among their friends, it's being talked about in their neighborhoods, and it's being talked about in their schools. The timing of this conference is actually very intentional. For those of you whose kids are in public school or even private school, this is the time of year that they always have these conversations. They're built into the school calendars, and they're built into probably at some point in the next month. I don't know why they decided to do this. They basically were like, yeah, let's have that conversation and then send them out to summer. Like, we don't want them asking questions for the rest of the school year. I'm not sure why they do it this time of year, but they like finish finals and then they all have sex talks like across the education. And built into the California Education Code is assumptions and teachings that oftentimes reflect a secularized worldview. Not oftentimes, that blatantly reflect a secularized worldview, and one that is oftentimes at odds with a Christian or a biblical worldview. It is, and it's by law required in the schools for instruction on all materials, and this is specifically says affirmatively recognizing various sexual orientations and discussing examples from different same-sex relationships, teaching pupils about gender expression, gender identity. Now here's the thing, and actually maybe specifically, it's literally written into the law that the very last line of the Education Code is instruction and materials may not teach or promote religious doctrine. Now, what's interesting is that there's a religious doctrine inherent in much of what it says is meant to be, it explicitly has to be taught. But here's the thing. We could spend all day talking about that. There's lots of conferences about that. Lots of Christians like to have all-day conferences about all of that. The bottom line is, though, I'm convinced that you will not effectively teach your kids about sex, sexuality, and gender by constantly complaining about the craziness of the world. Like, I think that's oftentimes what we're like, I don't know how, you know what, in earshot of my kids, I'm just gonna like constantly talk about how crazy things have gotten, and they're gonna absorb the craziness, or they're gonna absorb how I actually feel about this. I also don't think we effectively teach our kids about sex, sexuality, and gender by regurgitating hot takes from cable news or from social media, by the things that really like get us passionate, or the ways that the world's so different than the Bible. Like, you guys, the world's culture has been different from the Bible forever, like radically so. And there's a way forward in this that is important to understand with wisdom and winsomeness and clarity, that doesn't have to be stoked by fear and doesn't have to constantly convey panic, particularly to our kids. But we also won't effectively teach our kids about sex, sexuality, and gender by avoiding it and avoiding the topic with them because we'd rather not, and it's so complicated. The reality is our kids need us to stand in the gap for them. Really, our kids need us to stand in the gap with them and model for them how to stand firm on God's design for humans and marriage with kindness and wisdom and courage. Because the reality is it will take exceptional courage for our kids to believe what the Bible says on these topics. It will take more courage for them to believe it than it took for many of us to believe it when we were younger. So we need to enter into the mess with them. We need to help them navigate, and which is why they need more than teachers. They need more than advocates. They need more than guides. They need parents. And that's why we're having this conversation in this. And they need biological parents. They need adoptive parents. They need spiritual parents. This is why I'm so glad that so many of you are here, even if you don't have kids, because whether you have biological or adopted children or not, you still have opportunities to be spiritual parents. Right? This is why we as a church are a family, and they need all of us to come around together to walk with them and to stand in the gap with them. And so, but they need parents that are informed and equipped, which is what we hope to do today. So, in your notes start out with a theology. It says a theology of gender, and on the second page, a theology of sex. The old maxim holds true. You can't impart what you don't possess. Right? You can't teach your kids about something that you don't know or don't think clearly about yourself. So in order to helpfully guide your kids through these complicated topics, you need to have a working theology of them yourself, which doesn't mean you need to be an expert, doesn't mean you need to be like the ultimate expert in the world, but you need to be thinking through these things and wrestling through them theologically yourself. You can't just be like, well, I don't know, I want you to know what's right, and I haven't quite figured it out myself, but, we'll figure it out together. There is some intentionality for us to dig in and come to convictions ourselves about what the Bible teaches about gender and sexuality. Now, here's the deal. That's not what today's about. Today is not to bring clarity or to wrestle with you through this. This is, in a sense, your homework. This is why, so let's talk about a theology of gender for just a second. This is why we spent this time last year, we did an 8-hour conference on manhood and womanhood, and at the end of it, Brian said, now we've just scratched the surface. Right? There's a reason why we did 8 hours on the topic of what is biblical manhood, what is biblical womanhood, because it requires thinking and wrestling. It requires various conversations, as we've talked about, as many we've had since then. And so I want to refer you back to that. If you weren't here when we did that last year, all the resources are online. They're on the website. All 8 hours, you can listen to it. But our theology of gender, essentially, a biblical theology of gender begins with the creation account. Right? It begins with the fact that God created us in His image, and He created us in His image, male and female. Genesis 1:27, God created man in His own image, and in the image of God, He created him. Male and female, He created them. We were created in God's image, and as a result of His creation and the male and femaleness of it, our biological sex determines our gender and was ordained and created by God. Interestingly, and we may talk about this a little bit more later, but this isn't usually the most complicated or controversial question for kids. Like the fact that your physical bodies are different and that sex determines gender, like they have to be taught that doesn't make sense. Like innately, they're like, okay, yeah, we're different. And that probably means something, right? Confusion comes when cultural ideas about gender kind of muddy the waters, but that includes, and I think that includes both overly restrictive and culturally defined gender roles that inform what a child thinks is a man or a woman. And when our gender roles are overly strict, when our gender roles are overly culturally defined, that's where the experience for kids comes, wait, I don't feel like I fit that. Right? The girl who is strong-willed or loves competition, but then is taught that those are male traits, begins to get confused and says, wait, I don't feel like what the culture is telling me is a woman. Or the boy who is sensitive and meek, but is taught that those are female traits, might become confused about his gender. Wait, that's who I am, but I'm not taught that that's a part of being a man. Which is why I think one of the most helpful things we can do is to believe and embody a biblical understanding of manhood and womanhood ourselves. This is why we talked about in the conference last year. Manhood, and the definitions are in your notes. Again, we took hours to unpack these. I apologized to Brian this week for using them without explanation, but that's what I'm going to do today. But just as a reminder for what we talked about a year ago, manhood is a calling to the sacrificial responsibility of either biological and or spiritual fatherhood for which you are designed. And this entails guarding and arranging life for the flourishing of others to the glory of God. Womanhood is a calling to the sacrificial responsibility of biological and or spiritual motherhood for which you are designed. And this entails growing and nurturing life and relationships to the glory of God. Again, I would point you to that content and the resources we talked about in the conference to dig in, but I simply want to make the point that in order to impart that, we need to have wrestled through these things ourselves and embraced and embodied these definitions that help us understand what it means, not just culturally to be a man or a woman, not just in our particular culture to be a man or a woman, but what it means biblically to be a man and a woman created by God. But we need more than just a theology of gender, right? We also need a theology of sex. And similar to this, we're not going to go into all of that today, but I just want to do a quick reminder. Just a few months ago, I preached a sermon on God's design for sex, and it was based on kind of this outline, this theology. What did God create sex for? And we need to make sure that we understand what God created sex for before we can teach our kids about what sex is for or how to navigate their sexuality. Similar to our theology of gender, theology of sex originates in the creation narrative, where in Genesis 2:24 and 25, Moses writes, "Therefore a man shall leave his father and mother and hold fast to his wife, and they shall become one flesh. And the man and his wife were both naked and were not ashamed." Has to do with where we come from, where babies come from, why God created us like this. The experience of our sexuality is innate to every human. And it's why every kid ultimately is going to ask, wait, why did God create us like this? And as Christian parents, we need more than the answer because that's how God makes babies. Right? We need God's given us in His Word a broader definition. And you can't begin to be truly helpful with your kids on these topics until we understand that answer, the answer to why God created us like this ourselves. And so again, in your notes, it's an outline that I went through in the sermon a few weeks ago. There's essentially 5 fundamental purposes for sex. But they're not all the same. There's 3 essential purposes. God created sex as a means of covenantal union, as a means of mutual pleasure, and as an expression of marital love. And these processes, I call them the essential purposes of sex, because without any one of which, sex cannot glorify God or accurately reflect His design. God-glorifying sexual activity has to contain all 3 of these essential components, what God created it for. But they're not the only purposes. There's also the blessed purpose for sex, which is that sex is occasionally blessed by procreation. Right? Sex does variously, occasionally, use the making of love to produce the making of life. And so we can help our kids understand the connection there as well. And again, I encourage you to, there's much more to go into there theologically, but I don't want to get bogged down in there. That's why we've done this in other places. But most Christians generally, and I'm afraid most Christian parents stop there. They're like, well, it's a way parents love each other, and it's a way God makes babies. But to stop shy of understanding the ultimate purpose for sex, that God created sex as a shadow of our relationship with Christ as his church, until we believe that, until we internalize that, we will always be teaching our kids something incomplete about God's design for sex. Now, the shadow component of sex is admittedly difficult to understand and comprehend and explain. And so you don't start there with your 5-year-old, right? But if it's not a working part of your theology, right, then we're always going to end up stopping short and kind of ending up just conveying something pragmatic about sex when God has created it to be something deeper. And actually, I think that when we stop there and even don't believe that it's about something bigger, God's vision for sex fails to be as compelling. Following God's design for sex fails to be compelling when it's not imbued with the ultimate purpose God has given to it. So again, we talked for hours and hours on these truths. That's why we did a long conference on the theology of gender. I would encourage you to reference that. That's why we did the sermon and the last few chapters in 1 Corinthians on sex, and I'd encourage you to reference that. Just to be completely forthright, and I'll let you guys be the first ones to know, I've got a book coming out on this topic for this reason next year. For this same reason, because it is so important for us to understand the theology of it. There's all sorts of resources out there for that. And I wanted to give you that foundation, and we wanted to make sure we point to that. But the main topic for our time today is actually going to be on the practical side. It's based on that theology, based on the things that we've wrestled. And in one sense, that's your homework, to continue to wrestle through those things. But the question we want to talk about today, and the question we've kind of posed for this time, is, okay, in light of what we believe, in light of what God has revealed about sex and sexuality and gender, how do we talk to our kids about that? Right? How do we actually have those conversations? And that's where I want to give you a few principles that hopefully will guide that and will guide our conversation as we go together. So, based on the theology, how do we actually do that? I'll talk about this some more, but unfortunately, you're going to flip through your notes, you're going to be like, there's not a script here. I'm not going to tell you the 5 things to make sure you say. But I want to give you some principles that I think will hopefully empower you to realize that you not only are called to this, but are equipped to it in the lives of your kids. So first of all, how to talk to your kids about sex, sexuality, and gender. I think the first principle is be proactive and persistent. Be proactive and persistent. It doesn't matter if your kids are homeschooled, go to private school, attend public school. Our society's secular worldview will be teaching them. It will be influencing them. It will be impacting them. And it will be impacting how they view and think about sex. But it's not just our fallen world that will impact them. Our kids' fallen hearts are going to impact and shape how they view and think about sex as well. See, when our heart that is bent in on itself finds anything that causes pleasure, its most automatic instinct is to use that pleasure for itself. Our kids innately, just because of the fall, have fallen hearts that turn in on themselves, and when they discover anything in the realm of sexuality, their first instinct is going to be to use it selfishly. That's not because they're broken, that's not because they're bad kids, that's because they're fallen humans in a fallen world. And so, being proactive and persistent, maybe the other way I would put this that might be a little bit more memorable, talk early and talk often. Talk early and talk often with your kids about sex and sexuality and gender. I generally, and we're going to talk about when this is not the case because for a number of us it isn't, but if you were asking me to like start from scratch, when would you suggest? I usually suggest parents start having that conversation at least at like 6, 7, or 8. By that point, and I think if you wait till puberty, they've already had a dozen unanswered questions. Before that, they might be curious, and you might have the question. You might have to answer questions and have those conversations earlier than that. But even without them bringing it up, I think starting as early as 6 or 7 is really helpful. Now, of course, you can't have the entire conversation that's needed with a 6-year-old. This is why I think the talk is probably the least helpful way to think about this. Be proactive in starting the conversation, but don't force it. A dozen 5-minute conversations are worth far more than one 60-minute conversation. Right? Be proactive and be persistent. And be persistent in having those conversations, even starting at 6, 7, 8, as they go. Be persistent in regularly trying to have those conversations because sometimes they won't want to sit down and open up. And that's fine, right? It's understandable, right? You don't want to sit down and talk with them about this either. Right? Why do you think they want to sit down and talk about it, right? So a part of it is taking what you can get, having a bit of a conversation, answering questions as they come up, but being persistent in regularly having conversations. Love them enough. And this is where I just want to encourage you, even though that's the case, don't give up. Love them enough to push through even your own awkwardness and insecurities. And if you hear 6, 7, and 8 and you're like, uh-oh, it's never too late. Right? Most of us blow past those ages without having any of these conversations. And you know what? God is a redemptive God too. Like, that's okay. Start wherever your kids are at. Start wherever they're at and ask questions. Meet them where they are. If your kid's 13 and you haven't talked about this at all, maybe start with a conversation saying, you know what? I wish I would have talked to you about this earlier, but I didn't. So can we talk now? Right? And start with questions. Right? What do you know? What questions do you have? And we're going to talk about resources and ways to start those conversations in a bit. But again, I think the principle is be proactive. Very rarely are you going to, every once in a while, a few of us might have a kid who's like proactive with us. They're like, I want to talk about this with you. That's not normal. It's great. It's helpful, but it's not the norm. Right? The norm is you're going to be the one that has to be proactive. So be proactive and be persistent. First of all, be proactive and persistent. Secondly, I think the second principle is be a source of trustworthy information. And I think this is actually, you don't have to be everything. You don't have to have every conversation that possibly can. I think that the most important principle is just establishing yourself as a source for trustworthy information in their life. This is why it's not helpful to like hide things and not tell them the truth about the realities of sex and sexuality. Right? Because if they know, in our world, they are getting messages about sex and sexuality from everywhere. And they know that most of them are nonsensical. Like they know that some of the input they're getting causes more confusion than others. They know that some of the information they're getting is self-contradictory. I'm not going to go back, but I was looking through the California Education Code again. It is like literally the Education Code is written with self-contradictory statements in it. You're like, wait, those two things, it has to be medically accurate and adopting gender identities. You're like, wait, those are two different things, right? There's all sorts of confusion going on, but what their souls long for is an authority that can make sense of all the craziness. And as a parent, you don't have to be their ultimate authority. You can point them to the authority, right? You can point them to the God of the universe who is the authority that their souls are longing for. And so whether you're a parent or a youth leader or a mentor or a counselor, I think the single best thing you can do for them is to help them see and know him. So teach them. Be a source of trustworthy information and teach them. First of all, teach them about God and life generally. Because we can't expect kids to find God's design for sex and sexuality compelling if they don't know God. The reality is, if they don't believe in God, there won't be a basis for God's design for sex and sexuality to be compelling. And I think that's actually helpful to remember too. Because you can try to force God's moral code on somebody, but if they don't believe or they're seeking his authority or understand his love, it makes sense that his moral code doesn't make sense to them. So we begin by teaching them about God and life generally. And that means not just teaching them, but embodying it. They will not have ears to hear what you have to say about sex and sexuality if you're not living an authentic, not a perfect relationship with God, but if you're not living an authentic relationship with God as well in every area of your life, including sex and sexuality. Right? Kids know, especially in the home, kids know what's going on. They know how you're living, and you can try to teach them all the right things, but if it's not what you're living, it falls on deaf ears. So your walk with Christ, again, it doesn't need to be perfect, but it does need to be genuine if you want to entrust to your kids God's design for the world and for their lives. So teach them about God and life generally. Secondly, teach them the theology of sex and gender. Teach them the difference between men and women. Teach them the beauty of the differences between men and women. Teach them the beauty of sex and sexuality. Know what sex is for, and then teach them what sex is for. This gets back to the theology, and I'm basically just take what you know and proactively and persistently teach it to them. Help them see that God actually has answers. Not just actually has answers, God has answers that are even more compelling than anything else in the world for his design for gender and sex and sexuality. Again, we've talked about that already, so I won't dwell on teaching them the theology of sex and gender, but thirdly, teach them the anatomy of sex and gender. Now, it's important to start with the theology of sex, but it's also important not to stop there. I think that teaching them the theology of sex, you're okay, I think I could do that. We could open up our Bibles. That's good. Teaching them the anatomy of sex is where all of a sudden you get squeamish. I don't know if I want to talk to my kids about this. How do I do that? Where do I start? What does that look like? But you guys, kids will inevitably have so many questions, so many confusions, so many questions about the anatomy, the logistics of sex. And if we only give them theological information, they will end up looking elsewhere for the specifics. They will end up asking someone else for information about how this works. And while you might feel a bit squeamish about talking about the logistics of sex with your kids, if you can't be their source for trustworthy information, and who will be? And here's the thing, honestly, I think this is, and we're going to talk about it in just a minute, but I think this is one of the biggest ways to undercut the draw into the corners of the internet that you do not want them in. Because here's the thing, if they have questions and you're not the one giving them answers, they're not going to ask their friends anymore. They're going to Google it. And more than not asking their friends, you really don't want them to Google it, right? And so being that trustworthy source of information, again, this isn't foolproof. It doesn't mean that they won't ever Google something. But it undercuts the curiosity that pushes them into that pushes them to be I've got to find answers to my questions somewhere. And discussions about the anatomy of sex, particularly in our world, always carry with themselves a worldview. They're not neutral. Questions about the anatomy and logistics of sex are not worldview neutral. They're like, oh yeah, it just is what it is. Like, it's not. It always carries assumptions with it. And so teach them about the logistics, teach them about their sexual organs, right? Be a source of information so that they can learn from you about a penis and a vagina and ovaries and testes and a clitoris and breasts, and be the one who's like not afraid to say those words before them, and teach them what the actual words for the things that they learned a different word at school for. Be a source of trustworthy information for the theology, for God generally, for their anatomy. And then finally, teach them the biblical ethics of sex. Be a trustworthy source of information that they can learn, because most of you have probably experienced this too. As crazy as the world is, like, the resources that the Big C church puts out on these topics, like, aren't all great. And so it's not good enough to be like, I'll find a Christian book, you can read that. Right? They need you to individualize and teach them the biblical ethics of sex in a winsome and wise, in a way that fits the situation they are growing up in, particularly here in West LA. In one sense, the biblical sexual ethic is simple enough. Sexual ethics naturally flow out of the God-ordained purposes for sex. God created, again, we're talking about God created sex to be a means of covenantal union, mutual pleasure, and marital love, and an expression of marital love. And it's only in that context that sexual activity can glorify God. And all other sexual activity is sexual immorality, what Scripture calls porneia. And it's prohibited by God. But applying that ethic in the sexual chaos of our modern world can be challenging. Kids and even young adults and even older adults are going to have a lot of questions about, wait, how does that, what about the different situations? Inevitably, in our world, the Bible will be charged with being prudish or narrow-minded or even bigoted. How do our kids make sense of the winsomeness and beauty of the sexual ethic in a world that doesn't see it that way? This is why being a trustworthy source of information for our kids, or all those we're discipling, will require being equipped on controversial topics, on topics like homosexuality and pornography and masturbation and physical boundaries in dating. And this is where I think a thorough theology, like grasping our theology of what God created sex for, helps us answer these questions, right? Pornography. Why is pornography bad? I don't know. I just don't want you to look at it. No, because of what God created sex for. And when it's not a means of mutual pleasure, when it's not a means of covenantal union between a man and a woman, anything outside of that, like pornography or even masturbation, doesn't reflect God's beautiful design. And inevitably, as your kids get older, they will come up with questions that you don't know the answer to, that you're trying to figure out yourself. So be honest with your limitations and seek to know the truth. Don't be afraid. These areas are too complex and they're too important to kids to tell kids because I said so. They need more than that. So don't be afraid to say, I don't know. God isn't calling you to, in every moment, be the ultimate authority on every possible question. But don't stop there. For the sake of your kids, for the sake of those you're discipling, continue to be a learner. Continue to learn. Ask your pastors for help. This is why we're here. We want to be a resource for you. Ask for recommended books or articles. Get equipped on the topics that they're facing. And again, the principle then isn't be a perfect source of unexhaustible information for your kids on every question they might possibly have. No, the the goal, the principle is just be a source of trustworthy information for them. And a part of being a source of trustworthy information is when you don't know, not making something up, but when you don't know, saying, I don't know, let's figure it out together. Let's open our Bibles. Let's read some more. Let's learn. So be a source for trustworthy information, being persistent and proactive. The third principle in the midst of our world is also be a source of protection. And this is, I think, related to how we talk to kids about sex, but in talking with our kids about sex and gender and sexuality, we also need to be a source of protection. We need to help them learn how to protect themselves and how to understand the dangers in the world around them. Because the sexual chaos in our world has made our world not only a confusing place, but also an increasingly unsafe place. And there's an easy way to overplay that and to fearmonger. But there are unique challenges in our world that are different than in other generations. There's different struggles we are facing than other generations have faced. And while we can't protect our children from all harm, it's probably important for you to hear me say that. You cannot protect your children from all harm. We do still have a responsibility as parents to protect our children from, and particularly the vulnerable anyway, from unnecessary harm. Right? We have a role to be a part of their protection. We can't protect them from all harm, but we have a role to play in their protection. That's why our child protection policy is so important in our church family. That's why we want to just continue to encourage you to help us strengthen that. And it's why you're why do I have to go pick up my kids? Can't they just kind of run out and, go anywhere? Well, no, we need to do things as a church family together, and we need to do things as individual families together to work to protect our kids. And teach your kids how to recognize and respond to inappropriate situations when they arise, particularly as they get older. Because unfortunately, they probably will. But it's also not just sexual suffering we need to strive to protect our kids from, although that's a part of it. There's also a role we as parents have to protect our kids from being drawn into sexual sin. Jesus was particularly passionate when warning the disciples about not leading kids into sin, not leading children into sin, right? He put the children in the midst of them, and he said in Matthew 18, he says, whoever receives one such child in my name receives me, but whoever causes one of these little ones to believe in me, or who believes in me to sin, it would be better for him to have a great millstone fastened around his neck and be drowned in the depths of the sea, right? He was driving home this point to protect, not just from suffering, but to help protect them to not lead kids into sin, to not neglect them and just kind of let them follow their desires into sin. And protecting kids from being drawn into sexual sin can take all sorts of different forms. It involves developing family rules. It involves limiting certain friendships, right? It might involve anyways, we go through all sorts of different family rules and specifics. It definitely involves nurturing a church culture. But of all the rules and all the areas that we could talk about, and we could spend a whole conference just, talking about that, there is one area I wanted to highlight. And I mentioned it before, I'm going to mention it again. Because I believe the single biggest way kids are being lured into sexual sin today isn't through in-person interactions. It's through the internet, right? It's through the internet. It's through Googling it. It's through social media. And it's why I believe it's appropriate to say it this strongly, but I believe that giving a child unfettered, unaccountable, or unfiltered, or unaccountable internet access, whether on a computer or a phone, is like giving them a loaded gun to play with. I don't think it's just like an oversight. It's negligent because we know what the internet holds. The question will simply be, when does the feed that suggests the next video involve nudity? When does it drive them into sexual sin? Because it is built, the system is built to nurture and draw them in to their sexual desires. And adults struggle with this immensely, but I don't know how many adults, young adults, I continue to have conversations with who the places their struggle started. The struggle didn't start when they were like 28. It started because, especially in our generation, nobody knew better. In a number of our generation, and I don't know, some of you younger than me, I'm not even our generation, but like 10 years younger than me, 10, 15 years younger than me, parents didn't know. Nobody knew. And so a lot happened. We don't get to claim that ignorance. We know what the internet is. We know how easy it is. And with the knowledge of the dangers in it, I think comes a responsibility in us to protect our kids and those around us from being led into sin. Social media is not evil. The internet's not evil. It's an incredible tool that can do incredible things. But it also has incredible dangers. As adults, it's our responsibility to protect those in our care from the worst aspects of it. It's important. So, on that protection side, don't give in to the hype. All middle schoolers don't have phones, no matter what your kids tell you. All high schoolers are not on social media. And increasingly, I think more and more of them see it and are like, wait a second, I'm not sure this is actually good for me. So, we have to keep going, but be a source for protection. And finally, so be a trustworthy source of information. Oh, the first one. I was like, I had another one. Be persistent and proactive. Be proactive and persistent. Be a trustworthy source of information. Be a source of protection. And lastly, be a source of grace and redemption. Be a source of grace and redemption for your kids, and be a source of grace and redemption for one another. I've wanted to dump a bunch of principles, but it can come with a lot of weight. Because here's the thing, as parents, we're going to fail at every one of these one way or another. Our kids are going to be blessed by having us as parents, and sometimes our kids are going to have to deal with growing in spite of having us as their parents. The hope for your children is not that you do this perfectly. The hope for our children is not that we as a church do this perfectly. The hope for our children is the same hope for us, that we have a God who can redeem anything. That we have a God of grace and hope. And so we need to both cling to that hope in our parenting, not get weighed down by all the importance and the dangers out there, not get weighed, cling to that hope ourselves and be a source of that by clinging to that hope and redemption, by clinging to the forgiveness he's given us, by remembering it over and over, be a source of that grace and redemption in their lives as well. Because every one of our kids is going to experience sexual suffering, whether it's in small ways through harassment or comments or jokes or in tragic ways, in abuse or worse. And every one of our kids is going to experience sexual sin. They're all sinners. They are. There's ways we can protect them from certain things. There's ways we can protect them maybe from the worst of things, but we can't make them not sinners. And we can't make them not sexual beings. And so they're going to sin sexually. And they're going to suffer sexually. And the biggest question in light of that I think faces us as a parent is not, how do we make sure that doesn't happen? Because that's a false hope. I think the biggest question that faces us as parents is, how will we respond when we find out? When we learn about the specifics of how they've suffered or how they've sinned, whether it was earlier today or we don't find out about it till months later, how are we going to respond? And there's a lot of practical suggestions I could give you, a lot of things I've learned the hard way, both in good and in bad ways, but I'd recommend listening carefully before you speak, working hard to not appear shocked, asking follow-up questions. We could talk about a lot of practicals, but I think actually the most helpful thing for both you and I isn't a list of, me giving you a list of like tips for, that you can be like, when it happens and like your kids, you're like, Scott's notes are here somewhere, like, but I'll be like, don't look shocked, okay? I'm not sure a list of suggestions is like the most helpful thing I can give you right now. I think actually the most helpful thing I can give you is for you and I to look to Jesus and be reminded of that moment, okay, how would our Savior respond? And how has he responded to me? One of the most powerful pictures to me is the picture of Jesus with a woman caught in adultery. John chapter 8. I want to read it to you so we can hear it together. The scribes and the Pharisees brought a woman who had been caught in adultery, and placing her in the midst, they said to him, "Teacher, this woman has been caught in the act of adultery. Now in the law, Moses commanded us to stone such a woman. So what do you say?" And they said it to test him, that they might have some charge to bring against him. But Jesus bent down and wrote with his finger on the ground. And as they continued to ask him, he stood up and said to them, "Let him who is without sin among you be the first one to throw a stone at her." And once more he bent down and wrote on the ground. But when they heard it, they went away, one by one, beginning with the older ones. And Jesus was left alone with the woman standing before him. Jesus stood up and said to her, "Woman, where are they? Has no one condemned you?" She said, "No one, Lord." Jesus said, "Neither do I condemn you. Go, and from now on, sin no more." Again, there's all sorts of numerous practical takeaways we could identify from this story. I could give you, 8 principles from this story about how to respond, but it's actually not the principles, it's actually the story itself that I hope you'll take with you. I hope it's the story and the picture of Jesus knelt down on the ground with this woman, prepared to receive condemnation and judgment for her sin. My prayer is that the story of Jesus with this woman is the thing that you might take with you, and that might, by the Lord's grace and the power of his Spirit, flood into your mind when you're sitting with your kid and they confess, or when you walk into a room late at night and you catch them, or something's not right and you begin asking questions and it just comes out. When your child or any child comes to you with the weight of sexual sin or suffering on their shoulders, and you can respond with shock or anger or disappointment or shame. Or we can respond like Jesus, who was gentle and compassionate and protective. And you know what the redemption of Christ offers as well? He also offers grace and opportunities when we don't respond that way and we respond how we wish we hadn't. When we even respond the way we wish we hadn't to moments of shock. God's grace is sufficient for us. He doesn't bring condemnation on us. He draws us forward in gentleness and redemption. And he gives us the courage and the ability to come to our kids and say, "Hey, I don't always do this perfect, but I want to try to show you Jesus. And maybe even in the moment I didn't, but let me try now." Unfortunately, living as fallen people in a fallen world, our kids will unavoidably need Christ's redemption. And they're going to need that no matter how well we teach them, or how well we model for them, or how well we protect them, that need is still going to be there. But fortunately, God has given them you as his parents, as their parents, as the adults in their lives to be tangible sources of his grace and hope, so that you might remember the story and might show them grace and show them the way of redemption. Now, I hope that in viewing kind of these principles and taking a step back and thinking about all that is needed, you've at the very least become convinced now that your kids need more than one sex talk. Right? They need more than just one sit down to explain to them the logistics and then not talk about it again. They need multiple conversations. They need proactive conversations. They need persistent conversations. They need informational conversations, and they need other listening conversations. And they need conversations that protect them, and they need conversations that restore them. But of all of that, again, as we started, unfortunately, there's no script. There's no, 5 questions to ask and then you're done. There's no, make sure you read through this book and then you've got it. Although we're going to give you some books and we'll give you some help. We're going to give you some resources. We're not going to leave you completely hanging. But it's important that we understand the big picture that those resources might fit into before we just grab them and be like, okay, this is all we need. Every parent I've ever talked to desperately wants a script or a curriculum to take their kids through, and especially when it comes to sex, right? I mean, that's what we all hoped showing up today, right? We're like, okay, this is going to be great. I've been wondering. Tell me. When talking about sex with our kids, we oftentimes feel awkward. We feel unequipped. We feel in over our heads. But I want to remind, that's all of us. That is all of us. Right? All of us feel that way. So if you're awkward or unequipped or in over your head, welcome to the club. But to guide us into and through that fog, God has given us his word. He's given us truth that we might search out, that we might study, one way we might talk about this later, but one way if you're like, how do I bring up this topic with my kids? Just have them read the Bible. If they start in the Old Testament, they're going to have all sorts of questions about sex. Before you have it it's great. But God, all joking aside, God has given us his word to guide us through. He's given us his church that we might support one another, that we might be a resource for one another, that we might buttress one another, and he's given us his spirit. He's given us himself. If you are a Christian parent, it's not that you're going to get everything right, but God has given you himself to dwell inside you and guide you in the shepherding and caring for your kids. He's given us all these things. But, as I say over and over and over, he has not given us a script. You're not going to be able to always choose the moments this topic comes up. It's going to come up, sometimes it's going to come up at prepared times, other times it's going to come up on the drive to school. Other times it's going to come up late at night when you're exhausted. Other times it's going to come up in front of other people that you're like, okay, how do I navigate this? You're not always going to be prepared ahead of time. You're not always going to be able to know exactly what to say. That's okay. I think the fact that there's not a script is actually meant to free you. It's meant to free you from feeling the pressure that there's one right thing to say and you need to say it. Because it's not about the one thing to say, it's about the relationship you have. It's about stepping into their life and being parents. Being parents in your family, being spiritual parents in the church. And so, it's going to take time, it's going to take multiple conversations. You don't have to force them to sit down and read a whole Where Babies Come From book, unless they're curious and they want to. I mean, you guys know, I've got 4 kids that are all 4 very different children. right? I've sat down and had this conversation with one who's like devoured the book, and another one that like we turned the page to the first like illustration. It's just like an innocuous illustration, like no, like I can't, like literally scarred. We couldn't have a conversation for 6 more months because of the pictures in that book. I'm like, dude, the pictures in that book? Anyways. You don't need to force them to sit down and always have the same conversation. You don't need to make sure that they can name and label an anatomy-gram by the time they're 13, right? You don't need to tell them about every STI in the world, or they're not going to be scared enough to not have sex, right? You just need to meet them where they're at, right? Be a person with a person. Step into their life. Show them the step or two in front of them and walk with them as a resource, as a guide. It's okay to slow down. That's where before we even get into the resources and things like that, I actually want to encourage you as parents. I think you're more equipped than you realize. And most of the time, we actually just need to slow down, to take a breath. Whatever age your child is, whether you've had the conversations or not, just start by asking some questions. All right? Don't start with a list of things you have to tell them and impart to them. Just ask some questions. Find out what they know. Find out what they think they know, but they're wrong about. Find out what questions they have and match their pace. And then just seize the teachable moments. Use them both to inform about sex, but ultimately to point them to God. But don't feel like you have to answer every question that they're not asking yet. There are some times that you're like, okay, I need to let you know what's coming. I need to stay a step ahead of you, and so I need to talk about some questions you're not thinking about yet. But you don't have to tell them the answers to every question they've never even thought to ask. Just walking with them, one step at a time. I know that in one sense, I hope that that's all really helpful. I know that in one sense it might be frustratingly vague. But I think it comes with a conviction that what your kids need most isn't a curriculum. What your kids need most is not the exact right book to take them through. They need parents. Biological, adoptive, spiritual parents. They need relationships that can help them navigate the confused world. They need relationships that can help them cope and navigate with their own fallen hearts, which means they need you. And God, in His sovereignty and in His unsearchable wisdom, has given the children in your home to you. He knew that what they needed was you. And in depending on Him, we can honor Him in that, even in these complicated and difficult areas that we need to disciple and teach them in. So, like I mentioned, in the next session, we do have a number of books and resources we're going to look at. We're going to talk through where do we start? Like how do you kind of, in light of those principles, how do you start and what are some resources that can help us in that? We want to give you some tools, help you find answers. But first of all, we're going to take a break. So let me pray for us. We'll take the schedule says 15-minute break. If I give you 15, you're going to take 30. So I'm going to say a 10-minute break. And then you can grab some coffee and snacks and stuff like that and go. But let me pray. Father, thank you so much for this time. Thank you for your wisdom. Thank you for your spirit. Thank you for the ways that you continue to guide us and direct us as parents and as a church. Would you continue to guide us forward with all the questions we have, Lord, imparting your wisdom that we recognize, Lord, not be perfect, but that we might be faithful to the calling of parents you've given as parents you've given to us. We love you. In Christ's name, amen. All right. Thanks all.
All right, I'm going to call everybody back in. We're going to get started again. So if you're enjoying refreshments or conversation or just standing alone, come on back inside, and we'll do our next session. While you do, a couple of notes. Note one, if you hear a low mumble throughout all of the sessions, that's not weird. That's us live translating what's being said. So just in case, I realize I knew what it was, but you might not. We are live translating this for people from Cornerstone Espanol. So that's Pastor Jose just kind of slightly translating very quickly what we're saying. So that's what's going on there. Two, I hurt my wrist, and so just to kind of get everyone in one fell swoop, yes, I'm injured again. Two, yes, I will have to talk about this tomorrow as well, so you're going to get a double dose. Three, it was a surgery for something tendon-ish, but not tendon. And I can move my fingers, and it looks worse than it is, and so just don't, high-five me, and we should be fine. It's the same Brian, and no, they couldn't give me any upgrades. I was just telling Will. I tried to get bionic in the process, and they said no. So what are you going to do? All right, so as everyone kind of comes back in, here's where we're at. Scott did the session that gives you principles and encourages you and inspires you and points you to Jesus. And I get the session that just unilaterally frustrates you. So that's what we're about to do. Because, Scott's giving you this sense of how to talk to kids in general about this and kind of some of the larger scale principles. My kind of question is, so what do you do on the specific topics they're facing? Which means that, I'm not going to give you, there's no version of this that doesn't leave you a little frustrated. That's okay. Scott mentioned that his was supposed to be frustrating. Mine is like a million times that. Because here's what we're going to talk about. We're going to talk about kind of teaching them things about sex in general, which is a large part what Scott talked about. We're going to talk about teaching them about sexuality, which is essentially dealing with sexual orientation. And then we're going to talk about dealing with gender. And so as you put these things together, you kind of realize, okay, there's no version of this where I can give you like the 3 to 8 talking points and show you how they intersect with the culture and what your kids are getting and demonstrate how to diffuse some of that apologetically while also inspiring. Like, there's no version of that works. And yet, we do need to give you a place to start on some of the really common topics that kids are going to hear about. So when it comes to like sex, sexuality, and gender, where do you start? What are the first steps? And in giving you the first steps, this is what I'm going to do. I'm going to go through those topics. I'm going to give you some of the main ways they come up in kids' lives at various ages. I'm going to give you a kind of, you'll see a little more when we start. I'm going to give you a kind of short phrase that you can start to use with the youngest kids. And then I'm going to explain to you how that phrase or something like it, you can continue to build out as they age to get more and more comprehensive, to get more and more impactful, and basically to fill it with content. And then I'm going to show you some resources that you can take and use further on. And those are all on the last page, a little QR code with the Amazon list. I'm going to kind of point those out to you and say, here's a way to kind of do continuing education. So that's what we're going to do. So you can see, I'm just going to leave you hanging. There's just going to be so many questions you have. The reason this makes sense, a lot of which is just, you're going to understand very quickly based on what Scott said, is because not just is there no way to do something that comprehensive in so short a time, but more than that, there's no way to do something so comprehensive that hits each kid in their specific situation with their specific temperament and struggles. That's not a thing. And so at some point, like Scott said, the parents, both biological, adoptive, and spiritual, are the ones that have to take the things that we've learned, the resourcing, and apply it in ways that intersect with those kids, those specific kids. There's no other way to do it than that. And so these really are first steps that are meant to give you something to work with as you take it and work it into the lives of the children around you. So that's the idea. And so in that sense, let's jump right into it. First, so sex, sexuality, gender. Sex, meaning a lot of what Scott covered, sort of anatomy, puberty, sexual ethic, things like this. Like what is sex in general? What's it about? What's it for? And so I told you I'd give you like sort of how it comes up in kids' lives, and then this phrase you got in your notes, and then we'll talk a little more about that. So first, here's how it comes up in their lives. And you're going to see this dichotomy kind of throughout this session that I do. Younger kids, this stuff always comes up through curiosity. Older kids, it always comes up through experience. That's almost always how it works. So in other words, in younger kids, there's mainly a kind of discovering of themselves and the world that gives rise to these conversations. So why do I have the parts I have? That's just how it kind of comes up. You know, it's, Dad, why do you have hair on your face and not your head? Why does Mom have hair on her head and not her face? They're noticing just different, like, Dad, your arms have so much hair. Like these kind of things. They notice these differences in the bodies of adults or mature teenagers. There's a lot of romantic, and or sexual content in media and billboards, even the kind that's not really explicit. Mommy and Daddy, why do they kiss on the lips? These are the kind of younger kids, they're just noticing stuff. And there's a lot of why, a lot of curiosity. Where do babies come from? Why do those people have a baby if they're not married? Like, these are the kind of questions you get in younger kids. As kids age, that shifts from curiosity to experience. And by experience, I don't mean things that they personally have experienced, like this happened. And so I mean more along the lines of, I'm trying to locate myself in the world. How do I kind of fit in the world around me on this topic? So why do I have the feelings and desires that I have? This is as kids age and go through puberty. These are one of the big questions that comes up. Their own bodies are changing. They're trying to navigate that. General questions as they're older. What is sex for and why? That's never a question you get from a 6-year-old. It is definitely a question you can get from a 16-year-old. And the questions are different because it's not just curiosity. It's how do I put myself in this place? Like, how do I locate myself in this world that has sex as a part of it? And in a body that is a sexed body. Like, how does that all work? And so these are the kind of ways they're going to come up. The one perennial one that we'll talk about, I suppose, as we go is also school. Like Scott mentioned, the curriculum stuff. If they're in public school, they're definitely going to get some of that there. But honestly, if they have friends, if they're existing in the world at all, there's a way in which that's going to come up as well in both curiosity and that kind of experience of locating yourself in the world. That's what they're kind of facing. They're facing kind of growing up in the world and being curious, and then living in the world and trying to find their place in it in terms of sex. And so what I'm doing here is giving you not necessarily the best phrase, but a phrase to use starting when they're extremely young and going forward. And as they go forward, you can build more into it. Now, here's why I think this is helpful. I kind of stole this actually from Matt Kleinhand's, not the phrase, but the idea, because he did this. He was a parent before me, and I watched him repeat things to his kids. He would repeat things like, Owen, sorry, I don't know, it's Matt, so I guess his kids. Owen, people are more important than things. Like, if they're not sharing toys, and he would say it over and over, because I was in his apartment, and he would just say it over and over again, and I'm like, that's kind of helpful, because you say it over and over again, and then you say it and then explain a piece of it, and then the next time Owen hears it, that piece is still there. And then as he gets older, it's like it can grow with him, and you can keep filling it with content. And I would try to do this in some ways with my own kids, theologically too. Like, I'll talk about sometimes God is the biggest, the best, and he loves us the most. Like, that fits a 6-year-old, kind of also fits a 36-year-old. You know what I mean? Like you can fill that with some real content, and that can be compelling for me, even though it works with a very young child. And there's plenty more. I do a thing with my kids with the gospel, where I say, what's the gospel? I basically pop quiz, like, what's the gospel? And then they'll look at me in the, because I asked them and they didn't know, and I was like, we got to fix this. And I said, like, you're pastor's kids. You got to be able to have an answer. Like, Jesus, God, okay, in Genesis, like, okay, none of those. No, we need to give you some shorthand to fill in, and they'll say, we are big sinners, but Jesus died for us, so now we're loved forever. 3 parts, all important, and you can keep that for the rest of your life because it can grow with you. These are just attempts, my attempts, so imperfect attempts, to give them something that you can start very young, but that can grow with them, and that you can fill with content. So that's the idea. And if you pick something that you can repeat, especially, I mean, a decent amount of you here have younger kids, you can start this now. If you don't, that's fine. Sometimes older kids and adults like simple phrases too. Not that you know that from the way I talk most of the time, but it's true. And so Matt's not even in the room. He lives in my head. It's a self-burn. He's not even here. So I talk about philosophers all the time. Anyway, so it's helpful for everybody. This is an attempt to do that. And you might come up with your own. But if you have a young kid or if you have an older kid, beginning to repeat things, a kind of repetition, a set of phrases and categories that you can use over and over again can be really helpful, for better or worse. And so this one is, sex is a special way husbands and wives love each other that sometimes makes a baby. It's a little long, but this is the big bedrock one, right? So sex is a special way husbands and wives love each other that sometimes makes a baby. You can kind of do parts of that. Sex is a special way husbands and wives love each other, can just stand alone. But the idea is, you can see, it encapsulates a lot of what Scott said. And so if they have that in their heads at a young age, because when you happen to have these multiple talks, Scott mentioned a bunch of 5 minutes, if you have these multiple talks, if this is something you work in, or something like it, into each one of those, you begin to have this thread that connects all those talks. And you begin to connect all the things you're saying around the phrase into the phrase. And so it answers the curiosity of younger kids. It helps you have kind of scaffolding to do that. It also is the kind of thing that you can build as they grow older. You begin to fill with content. And let me just kind of give you some ways you can do that. Each word can begin to have be a bucket that you can begin to fill with content. So the word sex alone, that leads you to the kind of trustworthy information Scott was talking about. Like the more they hear the word sex and they have trustworthy information inside of that word, the better they're going to be as they age. And so immediately you have some kind of a bucket to fill. But a lot more than that, sex is a special way husbands and wives love each other. That word special is an interesting word because it communicates uniqueness and it communicates a kind of reverence that's not idolatry. So they're going to end up in a world where sex is either idolized or casual or somehow both. And the word special is a way that you can begin to talk about, okay, it's not nothing. It's not just an appetite. It's also not everything. It's not the sum total of love. It's a special way that husbands and wives love each other. And you begin to fill that with content. So every time they hear sex is a special way, they're beginning to have that comes right in with the phrase. Husbands and wives, that's kind of unique phrasing. When they're young, you might say mommies and daddies. It can get a little easier that way because husbands and wives is unwieldy for a 6-year-old sometimes. But that communicates the exclusiveness of sex. There's a reason why it's not two human beings. There's a reason why it's husbands and wives, and that gives you a chance to speak in to that exclusiveness. There's also loving each other. There's a deep connection between love, sex, and marriage that's robust and rich and not complicated, but it's thick. This set of connections between love and sex and marriage. And when you say this is a unique way husbands and wives love each other, that's a place you begin to grow. So a 16-year-old, you can really spend a lot of time talking about that connection, even using a phrase they knew when they were 7. And then finally, the sometimes makes a baby. This is interesting when Scott talks about kind of the blessed purpose of sex. Sex as a category, sex as a thing that exists is ordered towards procreation. Not each instance. Each instance of sex doesn't necessarily result in procreation. Sometimes many instances of sex don't result in procreation. But as a unit, as a thing, as a category, it's ordered towards procreation. It's love propagating life. And in that sense, there is a deep connection between sex and babies. And kids ought to know that connection. Not just the fact that, Scott did a pretty great job, but at the end, all this scaring them into every STI. But it's not just don't do it or you might have a kid. It's a bad way of going about this. Kids are great. You shouldn't program against kids in the way you teach them about sex. It's a bad call. At the same time, you should let them know that it's not always, but the main idea is there is a thick and a rich connection between what sex is and procreation. Sometimes it makes a baby. And so you can see how a simple phrase that a 7-year-old could really understand can contain so much. And all of that, this is actually one of the ones I would have liked. Scott gave me a longer one. I would have liked to keep this longer, but you got to have it somewhat memorable, somewhat shorter. All of that only makes sense, this whole thing, in light of God. So God's not in this one, but the whole thing only holds together in light of God. Because what you have in sex, as a special way husbands and wives love each other that sometimes makes a baby, is this connection between love, covenant, sacrifice, vulnerability, giving of self, newness of life. Like, this is how all of God's creation works. And there's a way that sex is uniquely tethered to that, a unique symbol. Scott talks about the shadow. The sex is actually a shadow of something larger, better, greater. And so in that sense, all this works inside of God. So there's number one. Again, I'm just going to frustrate you endlessly because that's nowhere near enough, but you get a sense of it, don't you? You get a sense of, like, here's something that I can use that on the foundation of this, I can begin to have these different concepts sprout that are all really important to teach my kids as they get older and as they begin to try and locate themselves in the world. Hopefully, an 18-year-old, a 22-year-old, a 32-year-old could still remember this phrase and have all of that meaning packed into it, and it's still potent for them, still powerful for them. We also have books. So these are the further resources on this one. There is a set of books. There's 4 by a guy named Stan Jones, and I don't know why I can't hold the books. I have to do one hand. But they're geared by ages. So there are 4 books. The first one's from believe it or not, ages 3 to 5. It's a book you can read. This is one of those rare things that Scott, Matt, myself, a bunch of people have all used the same resource. It's just that's kind of rare. But I think they're really good. And you can read this with your child, and it goes through all the things, most of the things that Scott had talked about in really helpful ways. There's 3 to 5. Here's one for ages 5 to 8. Then you graduate to kind of it looks like more of a real book from ages 8 to 11. And finally, there's one from ages 11 to 14 that takes you through. These are just really good at getting at the general anatomy, puberty, sex, its relationship to marriage and babies and all these things in a way that's geared to different ages. It can grow with them, and you can read it with them and discuss it with them. There's also, unfortunately, there's a couple books on the list we don't have, but Stan Jones wrote a book that's also for parents that I believe is called How to Talk to Your Kids About Sex. So kind of on the nose, but helpful, because he's the guy that wrote these. And so if you grab a hold of these sorts of things, this is the kind of thing you can turn to and go, I want more equipping for myself on this. You can pick these up, and you can get some of that equipping. And some of them, we're going to do this for every set of resources. There are some that are for kids of various ages, then some for adults. And so those are kind of both all in one. Okay. I was about to say any questions. That's a bad idea. So, don't know why I had that instinct. So next, sexuality. So this is really, we're talking here about orientation, about heterosexuality, homosexuality, these kind of ideas. Again, this hits kids in younger and older age brackets in curiosity and experience. Younger kids, why do boys only marry girls is a question I've gotten from 5-year-olds. Just 'cause they were curious. That's weird. There's 2 of us. Why is that the arrangement? Like, well, here's why. And then you also, at a very young age these days, especially where we live, you will have 6-year-olds, 7-year-olds who have friends who have 2 moms or 2 dads. And they'll come home from school, and they will mention it, and they will be like, that's weird. What's that about? I have a mommy and a daddy. They got 2 mommies. I didn't know that was a thing. It's very just curiosity. As they age, it becomes experience. It becomes locating themselves in the world that they're in. And so how do I think about my friend who just came out? Which is happening younger and younger and younger. So there are kids in elementary school who are coming out, and there's all sorts of complications around that and how you think about that and what's actually happening there. But it's at a younger and younger age that you're finding kids having to navigate, like, how do I treat my friend who just said she's bi? Like, well, I don't know what that means. Mom, what does that mean? I don't know what that means. I don't know if she knows what that means, but she says that's what she is. So how do I, what do we do here? How do I handle my own questions about attraction and sex? There's plenty of ways it's not just something they experience outside of them. It can be plenty of ways it's something they experience inside of them. What do I do with this? What about loving others? How do I love my friend who is gay? Like, what do I do with that? How do I handle that? And then there's also ways that this can show up, I guess in very surprising ways. And so sometimes the first question isn't always the real question as kids get older. And it's true with adults, too. We do this all the time. The first question isn't always the real question. You might open with something, and you might yourself not know that the real question is something a little bit further down and to the left. So you're not really sure how that works. But you might feel the question about, the Bible. How do we know the Bible's true? How do we know what we should and shouldn't, do with the Bible or believe about the Bible? You answer a Bible question, and if you take enough time to listen and ask follow-up questions the way Scott has talked to us about earlier, you realize, oh, this is actually connected to sexuality. There's ways that something gave rise to this. That's not always true. I'm not saying every question about the Bible is about sex, but I am saying that, well, a lot of them are, but I am saying that there's ways that can happen, that the first question isn't always the real question. And so there's plenty of ways that older kids are going to be asking questions or making statements or assertions that are geared to maybe, even unconsciously or unintentionally, get you to a different place in a different conversation. And as parents and spiritual parents, it can help to know that and try and find what the real question is underneath maybe the first question. So that's what tends to happen on this topic. Here's the phrase for the youngest kids to grow into. Who you marry is about more than how you feel. And you notice I have marry/love, and we'll talk about that in a second, but who you love is about more than how you feel. When I do this, I talk about the we're kind to everyone sandwich, which is wrong because it's actually the bread, but whatever. The idea is that, and this is how I've done it with my kids, for better or worse, when they have questions on this, or if they don't have questions and they bring up a friend that has two moms, two dads, whatever, I don't just kind of I don't wedge myself in there, but when it's appropriate, I'll say, Jesus has told us to be kind to everyone. We also believe that marriage is about more than just how you feel. And Jesus has told us that even so, we're supposed to be kind to everyone. And part of the reason I do that is because younger kids don't have a filter. And so you want to be a little careful, not to make them ashamed of the truth or anything, but when a 6-year-old might roll in and be like, the Bible says your dads are wrong. It's okay, maybe that's not our opener. Plus, it just genuinely, it's not a kind approach. You want to the point isn't just to give them truth about this topic. The point is to give them truth about God and the world and all things, right? So kindness is actually a pretty big part of this because kindness is kind of a part of all things. Love is patient, love is kind. And so in that sense, there's a way you can sandwich these sorts of things that make them helpful. But this is that phrase, and I do use this one. We believe who you marry is about more than how you feel. And sometimes I will swap it out. We believe who you love is about more than how you feel. And here's how you begin to fill that out. And again, it's kind of word by word. Marry/love, I flip them, I alternate them in some ways to demonstrate the connection between the two. That these are deeply connected, and at the exact same time to demonstrate that this isn't just true about sexuality. So there's a way that, this could get long and I won't let it, but there's a way that you can begin to equip kids on sex, sexuality, gender in ways that is kind of discrete, zip-locked topics away from everything else. And it doesn't work well when you do that because none of life is zip-locked away from the rest of life. And so there's a way that our our approach towards sexuality is not because, let me start with that again. Our approach to sexuality is based on our approach to love, not restricted to just sexuality. The truth is, apart from sexuality, in every relationship, who you love is about more than how you feel. That's true across the board. That's woven into creation. That's how love exists. That's what it is in its natural state. Love is about more than how you feel everywhere. So of course it's going to be true here. So you can see how you can begin. That's a pretty rich concept. That the love we have in a more general sense, love for God, love for neighbor, If we're talking love for neighbor, that love kind of can refract out into things like deep friendship, into things like marriage. And all of those have a connection, even though they're not the same. And you can build that into a simple phrase like who you marry or love is about more than how you feel. That's kind of an amazing thing you'd be able to do to carry that with you. The word love also it gives you a chance to talk about how attraction is connected to but different than love. So your attraction is connected to love, but it's different than love. In other words, Dave's right there, in a phrase I have stolen liberally from him, the Venn diagram has some purple in it, but it's still a Venn diagram. It's still plenty of red and plenty of blue. So attraction is connected to, but different than love. And so that's one of the things that you can begin to build into this phrase. Who you love is about more than how you feel, because attraction isn't immediately, do not pass go, do not collect $200, love. It is all sorts of other things that are involved in that you can begin to teach children as they grow into adults. And that phrase, more than how you feel, does bring you like that relationship between your feelings and your decisions and identity. That is something that is very difficult to get across today based on how the world, like the city has a way of communicating that your feelings are who you are. They're not distinct from who you are. I had someone say the other day, they were talking to kids and they were saying, your feelings are like fish in a pond, and your job is to be the pond, not the fish. And I was like, that's actually pretty good. Like there's a way in which, we can get into theology of emotions. It's a bunch of more stuff there. But the main point is, out in the world, if you feel it, you are it. And that's just it's a really damaging way to live, even outside of the realm of sexuality. It's also a really damaging way to live in this category, and it's the kind of thing that you want to build a category for inside of this kind of phrase. It's like, it's more than how you feel, because notice, it's not denying how you feel. It's about not letting your feelings, even your deep ones, be the ultimate authority in your life. Your feelings are important, but not determinative. Your feelings are real, and you don't need to deny them or squish them down, but they're not the thing that tells you who you are, and they're not the thing that guides all of your decisions. It's not inauthentic to evaluate your feelings. So more than how you feel carries a lot of weight, and you can see how that can allow them to navigate the world with wisdom in ways that are far beyond just sexuality. But to tell a kid who you marry and love is about more than how you feel has a lot of things you can build into it. Of course, this one begs a why question. And that's part of the beauty of this kind of phrase too. Why is it that way? Like, why is it more than how you feel? My feelings are very strong. Why does it have to be this way? And that's where essentially your answer has to tap into things that are about a lot more than sexuality. Again, you can't ziplock this off. This only works, it only ever works, if it's inside a foundation of other theological truths and in lives that live them out. Because at some level, you're trying to show your kids and yourself that these topics fit in to all the other topics. Everything is connected. Everything grows together and sits together. Because they're not just getting an isolated idea of marriage and gender in their school curriculum or in the billboards or whatever. They're not just getting like this, they're not getting just this one phrase. It's like, hey, FYI, men should be able to marry men and women should be able to marry women. And that's disconnected from everything else. No, of course not. They're getting in, all of that is woven into a whole network of ideas about what life is like and what flourishing looks like and where you find joy and how the human life is meant to be lived and how we can progress as a society. That's all connected. And so if your answer is just the competing phrase, that's not going to do much. The answer has to be that phrase inside of our own vision, a better, more robust, more biblical vision, which is more accurate to creation, the world, and reality, about what it means to flourish as a human being and how you live out your identity and how God made you to be and how you live life in a certain way. All of that needs to sit together. And so in that way, this kind of phrase is the kind of phrase that moves you towards the answer to that. Why is it this way? Oh, let me tell you. Because we have better answers. And I think at some point we have to let that light shine and know that good truth on other topics that don't seem related, like Scripture and the gospel and God's character, all feed into this question and all make it something that really shines as a way of living. Scott kind of alluded to it earlier, but the Christian sexual ethic is beautiful and rich and joyous. It's not damaging. It's the only one that isn't damaging. And so to show them that requires a lot more than just like the right phrase. It's how that phrase fits into a whole vision of what the Christian life is about and why it's so beautiful and why it's better, why it's a better way in the language of our sermon series. So there's that phrase. And so hopefully, again, I'm frustrating you, but here's some more resources so we can do. Take it up with them. This is a phenomenal book series for young kids. I think it's I call it the God Made series. We have a couple out in the resource library right now. There's a ton of them. I haven't found one I don't like. This is by Marty Machowski. This is God Made Boys and... Wait, sorry, wrong one. Wrong one. This is the one for this one. A Child's First Book About Marriage. It's by Janie Ortland. Some of you might have heard of Ray Ortland. He's a pastor out in Nashville. His wife wrote this. The subtitle is God's Way is Always the Best. And this takes you through just a general idea of the beauty of the Christian idea of marriage. And it touches on all these ideas of sexuality along the way, but it does it in a way that's not like overdone or too heavy or too like pointed. It really does it in light of the beauty of the Christian sexual ethic. And so it's a really cool way to like give something to young kids and read it with them. It doesn't feel like you're trying to have like this big conversation. You're just reading a book about some stuff, and it's helpful. On top of that, in your resources section, there's one book we don't have for like older kids and teenagers is Preston Sprinkle wrote a book called Living in a Gray World. I don't have to show you, but it's on the list. It's essentially a book for teenagers that's a teenage version, give or take, of this book called People to Be Loved that he wrote, which we recommended for the parents and spiritual parents as well. This is a book on homosexuality that's written in a way I've never seen anything written because it's written almost entirely in conversation with people who are homosexual. And so the idea of love is built into the book. He can't get away with simple arguments. He can't get away with like, well, of course you'll agree with me, so I can speak loosely. He really has to be so careful, and he lands in a traditional Christian sexual ethic. And so it's a really great way to kind of work through the topic and not just know answers to questions, but know a heart behind a Christian approach to things. And there's another one on there that is relatively recent by a guy named Mark Yarhouse called Understanding Sexual Identity. It's technically a resource for youth ministers, but it's phenomenal for parents, and it goes through a lot of the teenage, especially, experience with sexual identity and orientation right now. Not gender identity, which is a different thing, but sexual identity, which is more of an orientation kind of terminology. This can be a phenomenal book if you want to learn more about kind of, if you're 42 or so like me, and you're like, I remember being a teenager, and it's like, oh, it's different now. This is the book that you can read and feel like you've got a little bit more purchase on kind of what their experience is like, because it's probably different than yours. But that's a helpful book as well, and there are some resources for that. So, next and last, gender. This is a big one today, for lots of reasons. Here are the challenges. Again, young kids are going to bring this up by curiosity. Can girls do anything boys can do? Can boys do anything girls can do? Why? I mean, this has actually happened to me. You know, my younger kids at one point are like, why is that man wearing a dress? Why is that man wearing makeup? I was like, please say that quieter. Be very helpful if you could ask me that in a more discreet manner. So I don't want to answer that loud. But again, you see, it's curiosity. There's not necessarily anything besides, I noticed something and I want to know more about it. That's almost always how it is for younger kids. And again, you can notice those same things and bring those topics up. I don't mean to present this as though you have to wait for them to ask something. I do want you to know kind of the insides of where they're at. So younger kids are not going to have really existential questions about this. They're going to have curiosity questions, and that's probably how we should approach it, even if we're initiating those conversations proactively. Older kids, again, it's almost always experience. From things like, I don't always feel very, quote, manly or, quote, feminine. Like, what does that mean? Like, the boys at school do all these things. I don't like those things. What does that mean about me? And vice versa, right? And some of the other similar questions about like, how do I know the Bible's right on this? How do I know, what about loving others? What about God making people a certain way? Shouldn't we respect how they're made? Why is how they're made connected to their bodies? Like there's all these kind of theological questions that show up and kind of philosophical questions, and then just the existential questions of like, how does this relate to how I feel? I've got a friend who says he really is a girl or she really is a boy. Why shouldn't I just go with that? Like, how do I handle that in a way that is appropriate to both my love for God and my love for this person? Like, what do I do? So those tend to be the older questions, more existential, more inside. So when you're proactive there, you got to kind of take that into consideration. They're living in kind of the same world you are, and maybe one that's a little more pointed than yours. And so we got to talk to them that way. But here's the phrase that you can start young and have them grow into: God made you a boy or a girl on purpose. It's kind of simple, but boy, can it carry some freight if you begin to pack it full of content as they age. Now God is built into this one. God made you a boy or girl on purpose. So by bringing God in, the idea of a designer behind your design, and a designer that's not capricious or mean or distant. So the character of God as good and wise, all good and all wise, and that God is the one behind your design as male or female. You can begin to build that in. In the beginning, like all kids need to know is like, well, God did it. It's like, okay. But as they age, more of why he did it, how he did it, you begin to kind of have that character behind the design. Made is important because you begin to see the idea that your gender is part of your created makeup. So how you are created involves your gender. There is a connection, a one-to-one connection with how you are created and your gender, which is kind of the main thing on the other that's being attacked, I suppose, today, is that there's not a connection between how you are made or fashioned or your biological reality and your gender. And we're saying, no, that word made becomes really important, that God designed, and that design is a way he built into you as he made you. And he made you a boy or a girl, which essentially is just talking about the gender binary that everyone can get so mad about, but that's a thing. And we're trying to get across the idea that as younger kids, like Scott said, there's so much we could say here, but as younger kids, they're sort of like, yeah, like, it's a girl over there, boy right here. Thanks, Dad. There's not a lot to say when they're younger. The idea, though, is to have that built in such a way that they begin to go, okay, interesting. Now, as I get older, you pair this with what Scott talked about like trustworthy information. So now you're actually a trustworthy resource for the physical differences between boys and girls as they age, the way those differences are designed and how they're made to flourish. You begin to connect male and female to God's design for human beings as a whole. So God made you a boy or a girl begins to carry not just content about kind of your physical makeup, and the fact that there are different, that these are the two. It begins to carry all this freight, all this weight that comes with those definitions we gave you about manhood and womanhood. That boy and girl actually is something that exists in kind of an asymmetrical harmony. That these are the kind of things that go together in beautiful and flowering sort of ways, not just in marriage, but in the whole world God made. Like that can actually be carried along. You begin to have those conversations, and when you say God made you a boy or a girl, they're going, wow, that's like packed full of information and joy and goodness. And then finally, on purpose. Now, in some ways, God made, well, on purpose is kind of built in. But I put this phrase in additionally because in the beginning with kids, just the idea that there's a good reason for God doing what he did is enough. Right? It's on purpose. It wasn't an accident. God made it on purpose. But as they age, seeing some of the goodness of that reason in the image of God, in being human, like together in relationship in the world, in Genesis 1 and 2, and eventually you get to, what exactly is that purpose? God made you a boy or a girl on purpose. And that's where the full depth of that manhood, womanhood, like 8-hour conference of the definitions comes through. Because all of a sudden now, when I'm a 42-year-old male, when I hear God made me a male, I made me a boy, on purpose, that has legs for me. That affects me, honestly, in a relatively deep way, because it informs the life that I live, and it really has behind it the full weight of like God and creation and trajectory and what it means to be a human being in the world, serving and loving others, a man alongside women. That's crazy that a phrase that simple can do that to me, but it can, because all that freight is in there. And that's the joy of what we get to do as parents. Again, whether biological, adoptive, or spiritual, we get to build that kind of freight in to these simple phrases. It's probably enough for a 6-year-old to be like, on purpose? Yep, on purpose. Okay. But as they imagine slowly having multiple conversations that connects just that little phrase with all the beauty of who God is, what he's like, of how he made the world and made it to work, of how you and I are a part of it, not just as discrete individuals who are interchangeable, but as unique individuals who are uniquely made male or female in our uniqueness. And how that relates to things like marriage and sex, but also vocation and life in the world and community and church and ministry and all these things. Like that's a pretty cool privilege to have, to be able to build those things in over years to another human being so that they end up being able to look at the world that same way, and hopefully better than you and me. Because when you start doing this sort of a thing, and they're reading the Bible, and they're also involved in the church community, and they're learning things themselves, and God is growing them by the Spirit, there's a decent shot that these phrases are going to be filled for them in deeper, richer, better ways than they're filled for us. And then at one day, they get to tell their kids, if they have kids, or they get to turn around and tell us the things that we missed about how rich and beautiful and full of glory this is. That's an amazing idea, and that's the goal behind this. Now, there's some further resources for this one, too. The one I accidentally picked up before, God Made Boys and Girls. They're all related. I'm going to give myself a pass. God Made Boys and Girls, Marty Machowski. It's a kid's book. It's a little long. It gets a little gospel-y. Like there's a full-on like Romans Road in here. But it's good, and it gives you a sense of boy and girl and why. I think that's a really great place to start. Again, it's the kind of book you can pick up and read with a kid, and it doesn't feel agenda-laden if you're 8. So like it's a pretty great way to do it. And it's not agenda-laden. It's on a topic. It's well written that way. And then we have, for teenagers, there's not a lot on this right now. And one of the best books I found that you could give a teenager, again, each kid's mileage may vary. Parents have to do this you have to figure out what's appropriate for your kid, right? So don't just like hand this stuff out because I told you to. Like evaluate for the kids that you have. Sam Albury wrote a book called What God Has to Say About Our Bodies. In there is talk about gender and some of the things we've talked about, but in there is also a lot more. And what I like about that is teenagers would feel like you're getting a book that is not just about like a hot topic culturally, but actually shows how that topic is woven into a bunch of other things that are theological, deep, and that actually, like the idea of pairing God's generous view of gender to God's generous view for things like body image, like and seeing how those can connect. I mean, there's ways that it's really beautiful. And it's going to hit them in a lot of different ways, and hopefully those connections can stick. And then for us grown-ups, as my kids like to call us, same Preston Sprinkle from People to Be Loved wrote a book called Embodied with the exact same style. He knows a ton of people who are trans and who struggle with it, some who have transitioned, some who have detransitioned. I mean, he knows everyone, and he's befriended them. And so they trust him. And so he's the kind of guy that can write on this and give you an understanding not just of what the Bible has to say, but how it intersects with the real lived experience of people in a fallen world today. To me, that's invaluable, to be able to have someone who knows those stories well and respects them and cares about the people in them while still holding to a Christian traditional sexual ethic. I think it's phenomenal. So it's a great book. And then the same guy, Mark Yarhouse, with Julia Sadusky, wrote a book called Emerging Gender Identities. A little more scholarly. Remember, his other one was sexual identity. This is gender identity, and it's the emerging ones. This is relatively novel, even societally for us. This is relatively new, especially the way this movement picked up steam over the last 5-6 years. And so this kind of book is also kind of invaluable if you want to get a little deeper in what's going on around us and understanding kind of the different, even terminology that people are using that's hard to stay abreast on, things like that. That being said, you don't have to read any of these. At some point, you want to be able to, well, I want personally, and I think you want too, to feel equipped to handle something that feels so big. And that feels like it's changing rapidly, both in terms of what it is and its cultural power. And so I want to provide opportunities to kind of avail yourself of that. If you want to learn more about this stuff, these are great places to go. And it's really helpful, if you want to have those proactive conversations Scott was talking about, it's really helpful to have kids' books to read. Like, how do you start this conversation about gender with a 7-year-old? I don't know, a book would help. You know, it can't hurt, right? Like there's ways in which that it's just one more tool in the toolbox to help you do these things that we want to be able to do. At the same time, this is not enough. What I'm doing, what I just gave you is not enough. It probably feels like rapid fire. And the truth is, though, that more of this right now, like making this a 3-hour session that takes an hour on each topic, also isn't enough. And taking each day and doing an 8-hour conference on it also isn't enough, because the point is that answers aren't as important as being good parents. The silver bullet that you want to have of knowing exactly what's going on in the culture, understanding exactly how to communicate the perfect way about gender identity with your kid, we got to have first steps. You got to have something to go with, right? You got to have truth in your pocket. But you also have to know that there isn't a perfect answer for this. And Scott said 1,000,000 times, I'll say it too, there isn't a script. And that ultimately it's educating yourself enough to faithfully care for the kids under your charge. That's what we're going for. So you don't have to read these books. If you want to, they might be really helpful. But don't think that you need to do that before you can have these conversations. The truth is that it takes a village to raise a kid, and you aren't at this conference so you can go out by yourself, read all the books, and then know exactly what to do. You're here to get some resources, to understand some principles. Honestly, for most of you, just to refresh on a lot of the stuff you kind of already knew, and maybe pick up a few new things along the way. And then to be able to go out and parent your kids amongst other parents, biological, adoptive, and spiritual, in this church community where we're going to help each other and be resources for each other in ways that books could never do. Ultimately, having the right answer, you got to have truth, but having the right answer, the perfect right answer, isn't as important as love in community with the guidance of the Holy Spirit. That's what we're after. That's the difference maker. And so that's what I want to leave you with, is ultimately, it's not going to be what you learn about these topics that does it. It's going to be how you learn the truth of God's word and apply it well in community under the guidance of the Spirit to the kids that God's given you under your care. That's what's going to do it. And so this is the one where you're like, okay, I don't know if I remember anything what Brian said. I might try and use a phrase. Some of these are lame. I'll make up my own. Perfect. Let me know what they are. They might be better. Okay? But in the meantime, we've got each other's back here, right? So we're going to take care of each other, and we're going to do this together. All right, let me pray. We'll take a break. We'll have a panel. Father, help us as we go. We need you for this. We need you to call into flame our own faith, to raise it up, to let it stand the way it should. We need you to help our kids and walk with them. We need you to knit us together as a community more and more that can be a resource on these things. We need you to get our minds right so we worry less about being in control and think more about loving and speaking the truth in that love. It can feel so overwhelming, but nothing is big to you, and this isn't either. So help us be faithful and wise and humble and caring and intentional, and know that you go before us and walk with us and hem us in behind. So help us, we pray, Lord, in Jesus' name. Amen. All right, we're going to take another 10 minutes, a tight 10, and we'll come back and we'll have a panel, and then we'll be done. We're going to get going with our last session, so if you can kind of make your way back in, grab a seat. We will keep on going. Slowly but surely. All right, so the last session of the day is going to be a panel discussion. We did this instead of, Woolsey, again, okay, here's Nikki and Chris Woolsey. Come there. No, you're in the middle. Yeah, sorry. My wife, Chrissy, is going to come up too, and Laura was going to be here, but they have too many children. So that's not going to doing too many activities. That didn't work out, but we will miss her. Uber driver this morning, she's in. Laura, the Uber driver. So we're going to do this instead of, like, you might think, oh, we should have a Q&A would be great. Not really. Mainly because, and you'll see as we go, the reason these people are up here is not because they are the parents with all the answers, and it's not because they are the parents who've never failed at this. It's because they're just a bunch of parents who have experience and stories. And for me, one of the best ways I've learned about especially topics like these, but kids in general, is by the discussions I've had, honestly, with some of these same people, typically at Scott's dinner table. Just kind of talking about stuff. How does this come up for you? Tell me your stories. And so this is really more of a storyteller kind of time, where I'm going to ask everyone a few questions on those different topics that I brought up in the resourcing section, and see ways that we can learn from their stories. A Q&A, while it might sound nice, ends up really just being, I have a question about my kid. Can you answer that? And the answer is no, I cannot. But maybe my story can help. And so that's the idea here. So if you don't know, Scott is a pastor here. This is my wife, Chrissy. Chris is a pastor here. This is his wife, Nikki. We probably know each other. But if not, there's the introduction. I'm going to sit down, and I'll kind of moderate this and contribute from time to time, though you might have seen me exhaust all my knowledge in the last session. So we'll see how that goes. So here's what we'll do, guys. Family dinner table discussion style. I'll go through each topic, so sex, sexuality, and then gender. And the question will be the same for each. We'll start with sex. And one of two questions. The first question is, how has the concept or the topic of sex in general, whether from anatomy, puberty, growing up, sexual ethic, why is it only in marriage, that kind of thing, sex and God, how has that come up? Sorry, hold on. So the other reason it's these people, I just realized I got to talk. So Chrissy and I have kids ranging from 4 years old to 12 years old. Got 5 of them. Chris and Nikki, I actually don't know the ages. 15 and 19, right? Yeah, okay. I was going to say 20, but 19 still. Okay. And then Scott has 5th grade. I don't know how it's 11? 11 to 17. So ideally, you have kind of almost every age represented. That was one of the other reasons it's that, these people and not other people. However, that being said, so given kind of our different experiences, but also kind of seeing different ages, for that general topic of sex, how has that come up in conversation and or in your kids' lives, whether proactively or in response? Like, what's it been like at different ages to see it come up in different ways? What do you got?
I'll break the ice with a funny story.
Okay.
Okay. So I have a 4-year-old, and my oldest is 12. And my 4-year-old, I was getting him dressed in the kitchen for whatever reason, and my 12-year-old, because I was taking my daughter to school, and he was coming with us. And my daughter goes, "Mommy, do you think he knows that he has different parts than girls?" I was like, "Yeah, absolutely." "Benji, what is the name of your private part?" He goes, "Penis." And then I was like, "Do girls have penis?" He's like, "No, they have a vagina."
Yep.
And I was like, "Oh, okay." And she's like, "Whoa, I didn't even know."
He said it way too easy, way too fast.
I was like stunned. I was totally stunned, but I was also very proud of myself.
You had that locked and loaded, bud. I don't like that. Yeah. I'm glad he knew it, but it was a very quick.
Yeah, I mean, I
quick
share that
response.
because I've tried to create a culture of an open conversation. If you have a question, at any time, whoever's around, we're going to involve everybody appropriately. And she, I don't know why it crossed her mind. It was 7 a.m. Why does it cross a child's mind to ask that question?
Yeah.
But that's my break the ice
Yeah,
story.
it comes up like that a lot.
What about you guys, Rosies?
I will say, I love how you guys just acknowledge the fact that we don't want to have these conversations either, and it's very uncomfortable. And thankfully, I don't know if you knew this about Chris and I, but we have a very, very important major in college, and we spent money to get theater degrees. And so don't judge us, but don't judge us, but it really has come in handy because I vowed from
Not
a
financially.
not financially, not financially, but as a parent, because sometimes you just need to do your best acting. So I think all throughout their lives, I just kind of pretended that I was that parent. Yeah, let's have these conversations because I'm cool talking about it. And so that's kind of how we've approached it, which I think is helpful because now that they're teenagers, it becomes more like, I don't want to talk about it. But they know, or they think, we fooled them enough times that we're the cool parent. You can come and talk and ask these questions and we're not going to freak out. So I empower you as actors and actresses. You don't need to spend money. You'll do a great job. I don't know if that answered the question.
It does.
But,
Let me put them together because it's probably more helpful to do them together. The question is how has it come up, and then what are your what are the successes and failures? What are things that have gone well and not gone well? What are the stories you have about on this topic, talking about it
Please
with the kids?
act.
Sure. So the other thing is using every opportunity because these are awkward conversations. You don't want to have them. They certainly don't want to have them with you. And so anytime you can have an opportunity where it's organic and it's doesn't feel forced or white-knuckled, and I white-knuckle everything in my life, so this is not outside of that domain. And so anytime I have an opportunity to have that conversation, just like you said, in little 5-minute bursts, it's super helpful. I remember one time we were driving down the road, and Cassidy was always very protective of Connor in terms of what he was seeing, maybe in some ways maybe even more than what we were. And we were driving down the road, and there was a billboard for a gentleman's club, which is the least ironic way that term is ever used. And Cassidy said, "Connor, don't look at that billboard with the woman on it." And I remember Connor went, "Why, does she have crazy hair?" And I was like, okay, well, maybe avoiding that discussion, there's an appropriate way to discuss what that billboard was. And so we talked about it in the car. I was like, well, Connor, that's, blah, blah, blah. And we talked about why that isn't healthy for anyone involved. And he wasn't so little that he couldn't understand what that meant and was, but it was just funny that Cassidy really wanted to protect him, but I hopefully used that as an opportunity because the subject was brought up, and it was kind of funny.
Because, by the way, when you say don't look at something, they're going to look at something.
Yeah. Yes, yeah, and
Well, but the temptation is oh, he thought it was crazy hair. Phew, missed that one. Let's keep driving and move on real quick, right?
exactly. Now, on the other end of the spectrum, we were driving by a store that was near our neighborhood one time, and Connor was probably too young to have the discussion about what he was looking at, and he said, "Dad, why do the mannequins in the front of that store all have masks on?" And I said, "Because Halloween's coming, honey." And we just kept driving because it was not an appropriate time to have the conversation about why the store had masks in the window. But I would just encourage you that whenever these things come up, even if it seems like you could avoid it, to lean in as much as is appropriate and organic and have those discussions, because those little bursts of truth that we can pepper the day with are hopefully going to pay dividends in the future. So.
Yeah, I mean, I would totally agree. I think that a lot of the best conversations come in those organic opportunities. I think if I think about any of the mistakes I've made, actually sometimes I've been proactive, and it's been really helpful because we needed to have a conversation. It had been a while. Probably some of the biggest mistakes is when I force it, when they're not ready to have the conversation, don't want to have the conversation, because it doesn't, like, nothing sinks in a moment like that. However, I do, and so those of you who know my personality, this will be totally appropriate, but I do have a reminder that pops up on my phone once a year to talk about this subject, in case I haven't. And most years, I'm like, oh, actually, we talked about that just a couple months ago. I'm good. But, like, I don't know, every few years, I'm like, oh, man, it's been a year? I probably should. Like, and so, I mean, even just the regular rhythm of that is helpful. I mean, similarly, the other context we have is in reaction to the world, in reaction to everything else. It's also like in reaction to our own mistakes. Nostalgia gets us in trouble because we show our kids movies and things like that we're like, oh, wait, I shouldn't have showed you that. And Laura and I did this just in the last year. We showed our kids like and we introduced it as one of our favorite movies. And it was The Holiday from, which is, I think, a great Christmas movie, very enjoyable. But we totally forgot about how immediately two of the characters have sex. And they don't like show anything, but like it's like they meet, and then like that night, and we're like, oh. And so we kind of like stopped, and we kind of like made a comment, and we like talked about it, and we'll like, fast forwarded something, and and afterwards, afterwards, it was one of those opportunities where I was like, okay, can we talk about this for a second? And we have, as our kids have gotten older, and particularly if you have, more than one kid, we have, as our kids have gotten older, tried to have conversations with multiple of them together, and even with boys and girls together, because sometimes one of them asks a question that the other one really needs to hear the answer to, and it's a lot more natural to have it all together. It's helpful for them to talk about it. It's helpful for them to answer each other's questions in ways that you don't have to. But this was now it's like an infamous night in our family, and I don't think our kids are ever going to be able to watch this movie again, because this movie got followed up by a like hour and a half family sex talk, where the younger ones decided now's the time, we're going to ask all the questions we have. And the older ones are like, and I'm like, this is so great that we get to talk about this. And it was super productive. But our kids are never going to watch that movie again. So I guess win-win.
Yeah. So the takeaway is show them movies you
show the movies that you want to. Yeah. But I share it because I think sometimes we think we've blown it when we make mistakes like that, right? And in a sense, in retrospect, it was not the wisest choice I've made. It was probably a mistake. But I think there's redemptive opportunities, even in our own mistakes, even in our own, the decision to be like, oh, we're driving through Nevada, like, let's drive down the strip and you can see what Las Vegas is. Oops. Maybe we shouldn't have done that either. I think they provide opportunities, even our own mistakes provide opportunities to open the door. And I think that there is a unique dynamic to having those conversations together. Even on the sex and puberty side, Laura has just made it a point, not like awkwardly, publicly so, but in our house, it's not abnormal to talk about menstruation. Because that's a normal part of life. And it's one that, half the people in our home are women. And our boys need to know that every woman they know, every other girl in high school, this is the reality of life. And so, again, not poignantly or awkwardly so, but also naturally so, to be like, okay, it opens the door to an openness to conversations and to questions, and also, again, to be a trustworthy source of information. Like, oh, everybody else seems to like hide and whisper about this, but I know I can ask those questions at home because it's actually normal to talk about it because this is human. So,
There's like a subtle difference that's probably important to hold on to between I really need you as my kid to see the world a certain way, and I really want to show you the way the world really is. And I think if we're doing the second one ideally, and that's where I think for me my mistakes come, my failures come when I'm like, hey, like I just really want to check this box, make sure you see things the way I want you to see them. Instead of just like, I like that example because like, I don't know, mainly it's just kind of, water's wet, the sky's blue, like things are the way they are, and we should probably not ignore that or like be weird about it, but just talk about it. That approach tends to make everyone more comfortable, even if it doesn't prevent failure. It just kind of like makes it a little easier.
The other thing that I think is helpful in terms of truth, and I think that is like gigantically helpful, that if our kids know that our home is an open place where we can discuss these things, it's great. It's also great if they know that we are a source of truth, so the things we are telling them is true. That's also fantastic. But I also think that there's a way, and I know so many parents in our church family are doing this, and but it's I think helpful to vocalize it, that if our kids also know that we are a people of grace, that also helps these conversations. I think if there are ways in which our kids observe us being not graceful, whether it's in our politics or in the way we spend our money or fill in the blank, they're probably not going to think we're going to have as much grace with the questions that they might have about this topic as well. Well, Dad gets really angry when people bring up political conversations. Maybe he's going to get angry when I bring up this question I have about sexuality or a friend at school or whatever. So I think it's super important that we show grace in all aspects of our family life, so that when these subjects need to be discussed, our kids not only know that we are open, that we are speaking truth, but we'll also have grace with what the truth or inaccuracy of what they currently believe, so that we can actually have these discussions.
Exclamation point, underline, highlight.
That's really good. Can I ask, in kind of a similar vein, but angled more towards the sexual ethics side? So we've talked a lot about just like sex in general, puberty, parts, but that movie is interesting because like you're talking about like, yeah, these people just kind of jumped into bed together. I'm assuming that was a lot of the discussion, like just kind of for the group, like when it comes to not just like sex as a concept, but like who should have sex with whom and why, in terms of like marriage or not married, those kind of things. Like how have those conversations, how have you worked that in? Is it the same thing? Is it different? Is there any uniqueness there? Does it come up in a different way? I don't know. What do you think?
Are you bridging the gap into sexuality, or are you talking
No.
specifically about just sexual ethics?
I've just kind of noticed our conversation so far has really been about being honest about sexuality existing or sex existing, and not so much about like, here's why it's for marriage, like that kind of thing, which seems to be one of the bigger issues that are at play now, even though the other ones might get more press culturally. Like, that's a big deal, and something that seems like we need to give our kids some kind of logic or grammar to why that's true. We're trying to do that in the conference in general, but I'm curious, stories-wise, like, do you see kids, like your specific kind of kids or like your experiences, do you see that being hard for them, challenging? Is it more kind of like, oh, that makes sense? Does that change as they age? How do friends, I don't know, I'm just very curious how you've handled that.
That's a great question. It currently doesn't seem to be, not that they may hold other opinions that they haven't voiced yet. And I think the way that, at least the most common way that I'm able to like work that into the conversation with them is when we talk about God's purposes for anything in our marriage, whether it's our finances or the way we spend our time or why we are part of a church community or whatever, and then I'll try and work in or our sexuality. And I say, God has very specific purposes for all of these things in our lives, and to the degree that we are or are not obedient to those purposes is going to play out with circumstances in our lives, or consequences, I should say.
I also think some of the ways that they've learned the best have just been observers of life. And I see them learning so much from looking at the damage that sex can cause in the wrong situation. So they see that. And then they see the value of, God's purpose within marriage. They see this, because they're seeing relationships and what they look like. So I feel like they almost learn best by seeing those examples. Because I think you can say things, it's very easy to say things, but it's sort of like the, okay, never mind. I'm not going to think of the saying, but it's like, what you do is much louder than what you say, and I see them learning more from seeing what people do in those experiences.
So I think that's, I was trying to figure out why that's not a big, controversial concept, and I think it's for this reason. Number one, based on what they see, they're like, yeah, I want that, committed, really close thing. That looks great. And I think in theory, it's not controversial. And I don't think it's controversial until there's someone specific they want to have sex with that they shouldn't. And all of a sudden, and so in theory, I think they don't need to be convinced. In theory, they're like, yes, that looks best. The rubber hits the road when it meets their experience. And that's why I think these conversations are only more important and more engaged as we talk with them about the ethics of dating, actually. And what shapes them, what shapes who you date, and why if you're a committed Christian, why someone who shares both your worldview and your sexual ethic, right? Why that matters. What to do when we want marriage or love to be about how I feel. And so I think when the rubber hits the road in specific life is where that tension exists, where I don't think it exists theoretically. I think theoretically, they're like, yeah, it makes sense.
Sounds good.
Until it doesn't.
Okay, that's helpful. All right, let's move into the next category then. So from sex in general to sexuality, especially in terms of orientation. Same questions, how has that topic, how have you seen it come up in their lives, in conversations, whether reactively or proactively, and how have you seen it, how have you felt what are the stories of things going well and not going well? What are the things you've learned at our various ages and things like that?
Yeah, I think there's a number of things. I think similarly, things, again, don't go well when I try to force conversations. And I think that in an interesting way, I take 42 years in watching culture and all the information, and I'm like, okay, how do I help you navigate this? And they're like, I'm not navigating this. I'm navigating life with my 5 friends. And so meeting them where they're at and trying to understand where the tension points or questions they have about sexuality are within, they're actually much smaller bubble oftentimes than, even if they're in a public school, they're still existing in a context that isn't every sexuality question that exists ever. And they get exposed to different things in different ways, but I think meeting them where they're at in that sense, has been helpful. One of the things that I've tried to convey that I feel like has been helpful to come back to, and you talk about these simple sentences, for the record, your simple phrases made me be like, oh, I needed these when my kids were younger. So helpful. But one of the phrases I've come back to again and again is to teach them, particularly as they get older, that sexual desire can attach to anything. Like there's this weird aspect of our humanity that sexual desire can attach to anyone, and it can attach to anything. This is why fetishes exist. This is why bestiality exists. This is why, and so in our humanity, to teach them that that's a aspect of humanity, that in our fallenness, sexuality, our sexual desires can attach to really anyone or anything, helps to lay a groundwork for, oh, well, what do I do when my sexual desire attaches to this person that God has said, actually, that's not how what I've created you for. It creates kind of an underlying assumption that says, well, yeah, that happens. And honestly, it happens to most people. That it attaches to different people or things that are not how God designed it. And I think then allows us to process the way forward. And in that sense, I think keeps us out of trying to fight against a specific label or a specific situation where we're kind of fighting a cultural battle. And we're no, let's just understand humanity and the way we work. And I think that might actually help make sense of all the various isms that they're going to come across.
One thing you were saying earlier about the feelings, what's that thing you always tell them?
Our feelings don't dictate our actions. Our beliefs dictate our actions. And
we've said that often.
That's one of our people are more important than things repeated lines in our house. And again, I think that's really important because, again, there's a million iterations of ideas that are going to be sinful that are going to come into our kids' heads. And if we can sort, there was a great book written 20 years ago, and I forget exactly what it was called, but it was basically 10 things that are true that will not save anyone. And it was basically all these biblical truths that were great and cultural truths, but if I convince someone that abortion is wrong, that doesn't mean they're saved. It means that they maybe have a proper understanding of this one facet of life. But if I, fill in the blank of the things that I can convince people that are either wrong or right, but that's not the same thing as someone understanding and accepting Jesus Christ as their Lord and Savior. And so I think it's helpful to avoid all the myriad iterations, and there's more every day, of these fights that we can get into, these cultural wars.
Go down a million rabbit holes.
Yeah, and they're ultimately not going to lead to the salvation of our children. And we can waste a lot of time and energy, and not that there aren't good things that can come from those discussions 1,000%, but I think if we can keep our eyes on the bigger prize, I think that's helpful.
I think my kids are definitely not there yet, but a good example of beginning the conversation would be with my 12-year-old, who one of the young girls that she kind of has a little click with, came out to her, and she just came home so disturbed and distraught. And when I kept asking questions, her sadness lied. She's like, "Mommy, I was happy for her that she had received a Valentine from a girl," and she didn't know how to wrestle with that happiness that she felt. And I again was like, it's our job to love people and be kind. You need to be kind to your friend. And she's like, I don't ever want to go over to her house. And I was like, why not? I don't know how to treat her, and I think her sister is non-binary. There's just obviously a lot going on in this family, very different culture than us. And I was like, baby, she feels safe with you. You guys have lunch together. Who else is she going to hear about Jesus from? I don't talk about Jesus, but you live like Jesus.
We'll get there.
I was like, this is where kids start discovering that there's more out there than just themselves. And I was like, if you abandon her because she has a feeling for a girl, like, you know, you might be one of many chances, or you might be a chance. And maybe she gloms onto it and she asks you more questions. Maybe she ignores it, but you're there on purpose. So that's like the beginning of our kind of conversation.
I think that's so helpful, and I think that even connected to that, one of the really confusing and really evil components of our culture is it's overly sexualizing everything and hypersexualizing everything, and therefore hypersexualizing attraction. And so even just to give our kids, I've tried to give our kids relatively as they grow up, a category for attraction that isn't sexual and doesn't mean anything about your sexual orientation, right? Like you can be a girl who's like, I really like being around this girl. It makes me feel good to be with her. I want to be with her more. And not like, I don't have to freak out that like, oh my gosh, are you gay? Like, no, there are men in my life who I really enjoy being around, who I am like drawn to, who I am attracted. Like there's a category for attraction that doesn't have to be sexualized or doesn't have to be turned into sexualization. So even like our world doesn't have that category. It doesn't work in that category. And so I think one of the helpful conversations I've had over and over is helping to give them categories and both for their own attractions and for that of their friends, right? My friend says they're bi. What do you think they mean by that? Well, I think they like being around boys and girls. Well, I do too, right? So let's talk about that, and even in that sense, expose the confusion that their friends are feeling as confusion, as opposed to the clarity that our world demands of them with those things. So,
I mean, it also helps to it exposes how much you need to recognize that each kid needs different things at different times.
Totally.
Like we're talking about my 12-year-old who's having this reaction that is very typical of my 12-year-old daughter. It's like, yes, she's going to freak out for multiple reasons about this, and she's going to have like this kind of very visceral, I'm a Christian, I don't believe these things, I feel overwhelmed that I don't believe these things, so I'm going to double down on the fact that I do believe them, but also freak out internally that I believe them. Like, I know that because she's my daughter. I have other kids where that will not be their experience. When they could have the exact same situation, friend comes out, and they will come home with different questions, and maybe not questions at all. And so just kind of knowing that, I think, is, kind of half the battle, because how you react can't be cookie cutter. It has to kind of be tailored to what you know of that child and what's going on, and honestly, what you know of yourself and what you're going through in that moment. Because you're bringing your own fears and anxieties to that conversation, so you probably got to adjust around you. You might be a different person having a conversation with one kid than with the other, and so you got to do two different things just internal to you. So it gets complicated, but hopefully not overwhelming, because what I like about the way you always handle that stuff is there's kind of a gospel core to it, which is just like, you know what, Quinn, Jesus never bailed when you were uncomfortable. He stuck around, so you should probably stick around, And with other kids, it might be Jesus was wise, so you got to be wise. But whatever it is, like there's a simplicity to drawing things back to Christ in the gospel that allows you to take things that are really complicated and bring them back in line with the story we're living in of God and Christ and the Spirit and the gospel. So I do like that part.
I do want to underline that, because I think my biggest mistakes with my kids has been when I assume all children are the same. Both of you are the exact same. I'm going to do the exact same thing with both of you. And that is not the truth. Just so you know, in everything in their life, every single child is so different and so unique and needs so many different things that don't apply to the other child or apply to other children in the world, but not them or whatever. Like, they are so unique. So please don't ever assume that there is a script or a cookie cutter way or whatever, because there is not.
One more plug too, while I'm thinking about it, for like the it takes a village dynamic of this. Like, there are ways that I know that I'm talking about Quinn, my 12-year-old, because I already said her name, so why not? They also, she's Pastor's kid. Sorry, guys. Sorry, kiddo. But there are things that I could say everything perfectly right, and she will hear it in, like, I don't know, maybe even like a rhetorically worse way from someone in her life group or a life group leader, and that's what's going to do it. Like there's just a way that, one of the things I love about this church community and the way that we do family ministries and kids ministries is these life groups. And as kids, I mean, it happens in the rooms, like during church, like the junior church and things like that in some ways. But as they get older and start to move from curiosity to experience, they're going to have people around them, not just peers, but also people who are closer to them in age than I am, and yet far more mature than they are, whom I love. And that's going to be where maybe a lot of it happens, and praise God for that. Like, so there's a way of leaving that it feels really overwhelming, but we really do have a whole crew together, a whole family together in this, where we make up for each other's weaknesses and failures. And I found that in my own life.
For sure. So the other week, Connor said something profound, and I went, I didn't teach him that. And I went, oh yeah, Abe and Jeremy did. Great, all right, well done, all right. Moving on.
And I'm sorry I keep like highlighting things, but like the one thing I just really want to tell every single one of you is literally thank you. Because it's not that, oh, I might cry. It's not that I wouldn't be alive without you guys, but like that's what it feels like. Mm-hmm. And so each and every one of you have spoken so much into our lives, but into the lives of our kids. And literally, each and every one of you, so.
It's my job to cry on stage, not yours.
Anything else on this particular topic before we move on? I mean, I'm happy to bounce around too, but okay. All right, so then let's talk about gender. It's kind of the more culturally loud, the loudest cultural thing right now, probably, in this arena. Chrissy mentioned, one of Quinn's friends in 6th grade has a significantly younger sister who is non-binary, I want to be so careful. Identifies it. I want to be careful on the one hand because there's a sense in which someone so young, I think adults can look around and go, I wonder what that means, in good faith. Not in making fun or mocking or sort of like making light, but just kind of like in good faith, like, I wonder what that means to someone so young. And so in that sense, but we're also seeing that those cultural winds kind of push down into those ages to the point where I think anyone would ask, hey, I wonder what that means, even if they're very in favor of the entire movement itself. And so that's like a culturally very loud thing that's coming up in kids' lives in a variety of ways. How have you seen it come up in your kids' lives? What are the stories of learning how to talk about it? Whether it's about the larger cultural conversation in terms of like transgender, or also the cultural conversation about gender itself and what it should mean kind of for individuals in society.
I mean, so I think this is tough because I think most of the mistakes I've made on the gender area is taking all of my concerns and trying to convey and make sure that they like know things straight. This is probably one of the most significant areas where I've taught things and tried to answer questions that they're just not asking. That like, I read articles online and I talk to friends and I hear what's going on in the school and then like go have conversations with them and they're like, what? Okay. I wasn't wondering, but thanks.
I wasn't wondering is a phrase I feel like they've said with their eyes to me so many times.
And that's not to say that we don't need to like, be having these conversations and be sensitive and things like that, but I think this is one of those areas too where I think what they're well-meaning but misguided adults in their lives, in like the school settings and things like that, are doing things that are making their lives more confusing. And I think not only them, but they see it in their friends. They're like, those things that the adults keep talking about are confusing my friends and making them ask questions about themselves, making them insecure. And this is where one of those ways where I think God's design and the clarity of it has actually provided our kids like a respite that goes, oh, that's less confusing, not more confusing. A lot of the adults that I hear talking about are making things more confusing. This seems less confusing. Now again, that's not a blanket, that's not every kid's experience, but I do want to be, wise and prepared without trying to over-explain, because sometimes when we over-explain, they're like, oh, is there some reason this might not be true? Right? Is there some reason the things that make sense to me that you say, I should question? When they actually do God's design for gender, and I don't even think our world knows what it thinks about gender. And I think most people are confused and scared to talk about what they think about gender. And it's just of all these areas, it is the most kind of, I think, just up in the air and fraught. And so, fascinatingly, I think that our kids have a safety in that. Now, I think that one of the ways that we can also, or one of the ways I think that has been helpful in talking about that is less directly about the issue of gender and more simply taking opportunities to affirm their gender. To take aspects, and you never correct someone into a vision for their life, right? That rarely ever happens. Hey, be more manly usually doesn't make people more manly. Be more feminine usually doesn't make anybody, doesn't engender godly womanhood. But seeing what someone does and being like, hey, that son, that's being a man, right? Even if it's particularly if it's in a way that the culture doesn't usually recognize. Being sensitive and caring about your sisters and being brought to tears because you're worried about them, to hear, hey, that's being a man, affirms them. To have, to be able to have your daughters hear affirmations of their womanhood, maybe particularly in ways that the culture around them might not affirm, that is connected to godly womanhood. I think when I'm able to do that, those have been the most fruitful moments. And when I want to teach them about gender issues and make sure is usually the times that I hit a brick wall or feel like I'm just kind of spinning my wheels. So that's at least been my experience.
I will say, with one of my youngest kids, she was commenting over and over that she didn't want to be a girl, and it started. She started kind of saying this on and off when she was 4.5, 5, and instead of panicking, which I'm prone to do, I kind of just asked a lot of questions, and the root of it was she figured out where babies came from and how they were birthed, and she didn't want to go through that.
Just understandable.
So again, I was talking to my kids about sex a lot. I also may have traumatized her. So I would encourage you to always just keep asking questions. And like Scott and Brian said, don't answer a question they're not asking. She still does bring it up. And most of her friends that she runs with are boys. She's very rough and tumble. It would be easy for, my mom friend to look at her and be like, what does she identify as? And she identifies as a girl. She's a girl. But I just have to remember that even though, she's interested in playing with boys and she says, I don't want to be a girl, that's not actually what she's saying. She just has this anxiety about this traumatic thing she learned about around age 4.5. So.
I think one of the other, just to bring it back to the gospel again, there was a time when Cassidy was very young and we were walking in a mall in Beverly Hills, and there was a Beverly Hills wife there that had clearly had a ton of plastic surgery done. And I don't even think I said it intentionally. I just kind of murmured it under my breath as we had already passed her, and I was like, scary. And that, which was awful. And as my kids often do, my daughter unintentionally pressed me on it, and she said, she's not scary, Dad, she's sad. Here we go. Here we go.
Criers
It's back to normal, guys.
Yeah.
It's back to normal. It's okay.
And it was just a great reminder that was a person that God loved very much, and for me, for me to talk about that person in that way was reprehensible. And so whenever these subjects come up, and whenever we have discussions about gender, and it's super frustrating because we live in, as you guys continue to bring up in this conference, live in a society that will speak two truths that are absolutely against one another and do it with a straight face. It's so frustrating, but rather than battle that every time, I often will try to steer the conversation to these are people who are loved by God despite the choices that they've made.
I'm glad you brought that up because that informs what I was trying to think about. And I think in my experience with them growing up and in experiences that they've had with maybe kids who are saying that they want to be something else or whatever, I haven't noticed a confusion on their part about who they are or whatever, but I've noticed it doesn't change the way I love them. And I think by bringing it back to that's sort of like where they've landed. Like, it doesn't, sure, I may know this about myself, and this is my friend, and I'm going to love them the same way, whether they said this or whatever. So I do think that's a helpful place to bring it back to.
Any closing thoughts? You know I have some, but I'll let you go first.
I guess in that, like, I don't want to downplay how damaging our world's attitude towards gender is to kids. Like, it's heartbreaking. The confusion that it is begetting, and the lengths people are going to reinforce it, and reinforce that, and the damage that is on image bearers, the mutilation that brings about upon image bearers. So I don't want to downplay that, like, oh, we just, I need to be nice to them. At the same time, and I think that those are how we engage with that as adults in our world and in our workplaces, and are all sorts of interesting questions and important ones. I'm just afraid that we can take that battle stance and then turn to our kids and be like, we need to talk about this. Kind of still in that battle, like that protective, which I think that there's an appropriateness to it, but you guys keep bringing us back to the gospel. And it's so refreshing for my soul because it reminds me of the redemption I've experienced and the redemption I have to offer to them, and the fact that our wisdom on these topics flows out of that as a great, like, whatever wisdom we have was a grace. It's not because we were smart enough to figure this out or because we were like lucky enough to be in the right place. Even the way we see the world is just God's grace, and to impart to them Him is what, in that sense, this comes back to more than, it getting the things or the specifics right, and so, I don't know. That's a little bit of all over the place, but those are some of my closing thoughts.
All right. So a couple of things. One, I think it's clear, not just kind of the power of hearing people's stories, hearing people talk about it, but the uniqueness of the stories. And I want to make clear that you've just heard a bunch of stories and reactions and parenting kind of counsel from people who, especially in these last two topics, that do not have kids that have moved in that direction. So no one on stage at this point has communicated any like struggle of like, oh yes, we're talking about how to help kids deal with other kids who are feeling like they might be attracted to the same sex, or other kids who might feel like they're not at home in their body, that's a boy or a girl, with adults who are talking that way. That's because that's what we're on the stage are sharing. I want to make just very, very clear that there is room in this church for kids who are struggling with that. And so if there were different people on stage, you might be hearing different stories. And that doesn't mean that these stories are the only ones, are the normal ones, the ones that your kids have to fit into. It does mean that it takes a village. And that means also, connectedly, that you should have your own conversations around a table with other parents, whether spiritual or biological or adoptive, on these kind of topics. This is just one snapshot of what could be yours in this church community, and hopefully that's already happening. But I highly encourage you to not think that, okay, the panel has said the definitive word on these things. We've learned what we can from these stories. This is the kind of thing that we do with each other all the time. We just can't typically do it in one giant dinner table with the whole church because they don't make them that size. And so ideally you can leave here and also be able to continue these conversations going forward. There is a lot here. There's a lot of other content available, a lot of resources, but Scott's last word is the right one. We don't parent our kids out of our own strength and our own wisdom and our own power. That's parenting in the flesh. You're not supposed to do that. You're supposed to parent in the Spirit. And that doesn't mean squeeze your eyes really tight and hope that God gives you the right words to say. It does mean parenting by faith. It means parenting by faith and parenting in the community of faith and parenting as though God is real because he is, and as though he loves you and your kids because he does. And so that's the main takeaway of all these things are just fuel that can be used by the Spirit to go to work in your heart and your kid's heart. But that's the game changer. He's the difference maker, and he uses us and these things the ways he will. And so to him be the glory, and put your faith on him and not anything else, and we'll walk forward together. So thank you for coming. Let me say a prayer, and we'll be done. Great Lord, parenting is, I feel like, mainly a battle with fear and pride. And so much of our struggles are struggles of what might happen, of struggles of how little control we have, struggles of worrying that we are not sufficient for our kids. And I thank you for the good news that we are not sufficient, but you are. Would you help us parent that way? Would you help us live that way in our own hearts towards you, towards others, and even towards ourselves? And would you let this time we've spent together this morning be a blessing that you use in the lives of the kids in this church, and honestly in our own hearts and lives, to draw us closer to you in faith. Help us as we go. Remind us that there's nowhere we go that you are not, and that your love for us never fails. So we thank you in Jesus' name. Amen. All right, thank you so much for coming. Have a good day. And thank you guys.